class, which is a cozy Christmas teddy bear. So I hope that you enjoy this little outline sketch that I've created, just as an FYI. I always like sharing this because I know that as beginners, a lot of people may be interested in, like, how did you come up with this idea? How did you draw this from imagination? How did you arrive at something that looks nice and aesthetic and balanced and stuff like that? What I do, I don't always work from imagination, by the way. If you're a Patreon member or you've been following my YouTube content for years, or my Instagram account or whatever, you probably know that for the majority of my pieces, I am using a reference photo. Not really with the intention of copying the reference photo, but I like stemming my work off some sort of reality, like a base, and then jump off from that and add to that and change it and bring in my artistic license. But in other cases where I'm working on more like simpler illustrations or maybe more of a whimsical style, I do oftentimes use my imagination a little bit more. Of course, I always combine that with my knowledge of proportions and composition and perspective whenever that is important in the little scene or still life or whatever it is. So I'm always bringing in my understanding of art fundamentals even when I am drawing or creating something from imagination. But something that I've been sharing in the last few classes is that as I am, if I have to come up with this, like, say this is the topic that won this week. So I looked at the poll, what's it called? I looked at the poll outcome yesterday, and yesterday morning I created this. Yesterday, when I learned that this is the idea that won, what I did was I looked for reference photos of Christmas teddy bears and sometimes illustrations as well, and even like Christmas greeting cards, even if they're not line and wash or watercolor, they can be other types of artwork. So I bring in I collect a whole bunch of references, and I take different things that I like from different references, whether it's a photo, an illustration, a painting, a greeting card made with a completely different medium. I take what I like, and then I bring things together. Like I stop observing the references, and then I just get to work on my own little illustration from imagination. For example, in this particular case, I looked at a bunch of teddy bears, some of which were not even Christmas teddy bears, but I looked at the eyes, I looked at proportions, I looked at ears and stuff like that, and I decided on this design. Like, how can I draw the nose? How can I draw the mouth? Where does the little snout or muzzle fit within the head? What are the proportions of the ear in relation with the head? Like, all of those things I brought to mind, and I drew my own little teddy bear. And then I took the idea of the Christmas hat from one painting and then the scarf from another painting, and I changed the position of the scarf, and I brought in the stripes in the scarf, which were not present in that other reference. Stuff like that. And that is what is called stealing like an artist, where you're not just taking one reference photo and copying it, but you're filling your brain, or sometimes you already have enough material in your brain because you've been collecting visual information on that subject matter for many years. But whether you're using visual information that you already have in your brain or new references that you're collecting for a specific project, like, make sure that you're combining, make sure that you're intentionally taking things from different references or even videos or stuff like that, and mishmash them together in your own way, and bringing in your own medium and your own techniques. And that is how you steal like an artist and you make something your own. So that is what I did here. The lights I came up with on my own completely from a different greeting card, and I just came up with the idea of crossing them like that in subtle curves. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to practice our bloom techniques with the lights, because what I am thinking is we're going to paint a subtle, like very light gray background, in my case with the Payne's gray, but I'll explain about the colors that I am using in just a bit. And then while that Payne's gray is wet, I'm going to pop in some colorful blooms for the Christmas lights behind the bear. So it's a great opportunity to practice the bloom technique, which we did use for one of our other pieces that we've been creating in this series. So I hope that that gives you a little idea or like, insights into how I come up with these little compositions that I am sharing with you that I'm creating for these greeting cards. Um, Hi, Paul. Nice to see you. Hi, Diane. Welcome, welcome. New York is in the house. Awesome. So that is how I come up with these, and I hope that you enjoy this composition. I always think of like how I can balance things out and stuff like that as well. Like the little hat is going off to one side. So I made sure that the scarf is going off toward the other side to slightly like balance things out. And then I wanted to create asymmetrical balance with the lights in the back, which are kind of a secondary or even tertiary little set of elements in this little piece. All right. So that is it for my little introduction. I hope that you guys are ready to practice your sketching and your painting with me. Let me go ahead and share my supplies with you so that you can make sure that you have everything that you need for today's class. Okay, let me change my camera and remove this little image. Let me know if you have any questions because I did share quite a bit of stuff. I shared quite a bit at once. Let me move this away and situate myself here. Okay, so I'm gonna walk you through like all of the supplies that I have with me today. Let me open up the chat, see if you have any questions. All right. So first and foremost, I'm going to be working on a sheet of watercolor paper from Bao Hong, and I get this via Amazon. And I really like this paper. It's like the third pack from this paper that I get via Amazon. It's cold pressed. It is 140 pounds or 300 GSM, and it is 100% cotton. Right? I have no complaints. Sometimes it's cheaper than Arches, so that's great. Sometimes. But you can see the texture of this paper. It's very similar in tooth or level of texture to cold press from Arches. And what I'm going to be doing for this line and wash piece is I'm going to use the back, which is slightly less textured. I hope that you can see that. Okay, this is the right way up, right way. Okay, so you can see how it's more textured. And this is the back. See how it's slightly less textured? Okay. Why am I working on the back? Because I'm bringing in a drawing pen. Okay. And the more textured your paper is that you're working on, the more your pen is going to skip over that tooth because it's too textured. And there is nothing wrong with it if you're okay with broken lines. However, you can damage the tip of your pen especially if you're pressing down hard on paper that is very heavily textured. So it all comes down to personal preference and the specific tools that you're bringing into the piece. Usually I just work on this side if I'm just creating a watercolor painting and I'm just bringing in paint and brushes. But today we're bringing in a drawing medium. We're bringing in a drawing pen, which has a tip to it. When I am working on a piece where I'm bringing in colored pencil along with my watercolor, or I'm working on a watercolor pencil piece, I would rather work on paper that is a little bit less textured. All right. I really enjoy using hot press watercolor paper, which is the least textured of all. And sometimes I also buy cold press paper from brands that, their cold press paper is just not that textured because the level of texture does vary from brand to brand. One brand that I always suggest or that I kind of provide as an example is Strathmore's ready cut watercolor sheets that I also get via Amazon. I don't have any on hand right now, otherwise I would be using it for this piece. But their cold pressed paper is not as textured as Arches paper or this one. So I can use any side, right? So there's that. always have in mind the different tools that you're going to be bringing in, and choose your substrate or paper that kind of is going to help you arrive at better results when you kind of bring to mind those specific supplies that you are thinking of bringing in. Everything should go hand in hand. But again, you maybe you enjoy a broken line, maybe you enjoy whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with using cold press paper with a drawing pen, right? It's all up to you and what you enjoy and what is going to lead to the results that you like, as well as your enjoyment of the process. Okay. If you feel like you're fighting with your tools to arrive at the results that you enjoy, then it's likely you should observe the supplies that you've brought in and make sure that they are going to be helpful for you for that project. Okay. All right, so that's a little explanation on that. Now, the paint that I'm going to be bringing in for this one is from Van Gogh. This is my student grade set. I have a student grade set and I have a professional grade set. This is a student grade, the one that I have in my studio right now that I work with for tutorials and things like that. And it includes paint, or has paint, from Van Gogh, okay? Van Gogh is one of my favorite, more accessibly priced, budget-friendly watercolor brands out there. I do live in Mexico, so this is one of the brands that is very practical for me to get. It is I can find it easily, if you will, okay? I think it's important for you to always account for where you live and what you can easily have access to, whether it's just due to location or due to the budget that you have. All of these different factors you should consider when you are choosing what paint to buy. Because when a paint color runs out, you want to be able to replace it quickly. Or if you don't like a paint color, you want to be able to replace it as well. Anything like that, so that you can continue painting long term, which is the goal, right? So where I live, this is one of the more easy to get, accessibly priced watercolors that I have. In my other professional paint set, I have a combination of paint from Daniel Smith and Winsor & Newton. Why a combination, you might ask? Because here in Mexico, it wasn't until relatively recently, maybe in the last couple of years, last year or so, year and a half, something like that I've had more access to different colors from Daniel Smith. I always like having undersea green from Daniel Smith in my other professional set because I absolutely love that green. But I have an easier access, or there is more availability when it comes to Winsor & Newton paint colors when compared to Daniel Smith paint colors as of right now here in Mexico. Not to mention, sometimes Daniel Smith paint is just incredibly expensive, and Winsor & Newton Professional is already pretty expensive, to be honest, for a little tube. So, this is what I do for a living, so I need to have both options. But it's just important, wherever you are in the world and whatever your budget is, that you make smart choices so that you can stick with your art practice long term. And also, something that I often see from people is you feel guilty for using or wasting expensive paint. And that is terrible. That is going to make it so that you don't create enough. So, in my opinion, it is better for you to get a decent quality but accessibly priced watercolor set, but stay consistent with your practice, than buy super expensive supplies and then not use them because you're afraid that you're going to waste them. Okay, so that's the worst. So that's why I always like providing alternatives. All right, so let me grab my paint color list that we're gonna be using for this one, so that I can provide alternatives for you. And I will be swatching these out before getting to the watercolor washes, so no worries. But hold on. We're only going to be using 5 different colors for this piece. Permanent red light, which is a warm red, okay? Sap green, which is a warm green. Azo yellow deep, which is a warm yellow. I'm going to be bringing in burnt umber, which is a deeper chocolatey brown. And then Payne's gray is going to be the gray that I use for the background and the cast shadow under the bear. Payne's gray is a cool blue biased gray. If you don't have Payne's gray, you can replace it with Jane's gray, neutral tint, anything like that is perfectly fine, okay? Let me provide you some quick alternatives for these different paint colors in case you don't have these, okay? So, permanent red light, which is a warm red. If you don't have permanent red light, you could use cadmium red light, scarlet lake, pyrrole scarlet, organic vermilion, Mayan orange, or any other warm red. By warm red, I mean a red that is closer to orange or yellow in the color wheel than to purple or blue. This is a cool red right here, all right? Which is Rose Madder Lake Deep, okay? This is my cool red. This is my warm red. Warm red is what we're using. I do have a video on my YouTube channel where I explain the difference between warm and cool colors. And I also provide exercises where we fill in a color wheel together. So if you're having trouble with color temperature and telling what is warm and what is cool, I would highly recommend checking out that video. I have other full courses on color theory that you can also check out, whether it's through Skillshare or Gumroad. If you want a more in-depth, like course with different classes that take you through, class by class, sequential classes, if you will. Okay, cool. So moving on from there, sap green, which is a warm green. Let me provide some alternatives if you don't have sap green. I have my little notes right here. Okay. If you don't have sap green, you can use Hooker's green, olive green, undersea green from Daniel Smith is also warm, green apatite, phthalo green, yellow shade, and there's also this other color from Daniel Smith, I believe, that is called serpentine genuine or genuine, however it is that you pronounce that. That is also a warmer green, okay? A warmer green is closer to yellow than to blue. So emerald green, for example, or phthalo green blue shade, that is a cool green. You want a warmer green, okay? And then we're going to be using a warm yellow. This is Azo Yellow Deep that I'm going to be using today. Let me provide a list of warm yellows in case you don't have Azo Yellow Deep. You can use Hansa Yellow Deep, New Gamboge, Indian Yellow, Cadmium Yellow Deep, or even regular cadmium yellow, okay? As long as you're not using anything that is like this, like a lemon yellow, that is a cool yellow, okay? This is my warm yellow, this is my cool yellow, all right? And then aside from that, we're gonna be using a burnt umber. This is a deeper chocolatey brown. And if you don't have burnt umber, let me provide some alternatives. Give me one sec. Okay. You can use Mars Brown, Sepia, Van Dyke Brown, Transparent Brown Oxide, Permanent Brown, Brown Iron Oxide, anything like that, okay? And then the last color that I'm gonna be bringing in is Payne's Gray, which, as I said before, is a cool blue biased gray. It doesn't matter if you bring in a gray that is neutral or even warmer, or that you create yourself by mixing together two complementary colors or blue and brown. It's completely up to you. There are so many ways that you can make grays and blacks with watercolor. And it's even better if you make your own grays and blacks than use ready-made blacks, especially, which are very, very flat and neutral. I never have ivory black, Mars black, anything like that, lamp black on my palette, because they tend to look very flat, very neutral, and they tend to like mute other colors, which I want very vibrant. So I would rather create my own gray or black color mixtures. And there are many ways that you can create those. I have many videos on my channel where I explain about how to create grays and why to stay away from ready-made blacks that you can check out. But I like Payne's Gray because Payne's Gray is a combination of blue and black. So it's not super flat and neutral. However, when I do use a ready-made black, let's just say that I'm working on a monochromatic study, it's fine to use a ready-made black because it's not a full painting, it's a study where you're focusing on just using one single like color. Okay, so that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Also, in the rare occasion where I do bring in a ready-made black, I always mix in another color into it so that it doesn't look like a flat neutral black, whether it's blue or sometimes I make it warmer, maybe with a purple or a red even. I just combine colors together so that my black is not as flat and not super vibrant. Okay, let me see if I have any questions. Let's see. I love Bao Hong. I'm glad you like it too, Melinda. I got a rule prior to tariffs, so have. I love that. That's super cool. Medan is made by same mill. Really, I didn't know that. I've also bought paper from Medan before. Cool. All right, cool. So now that I've explained about my watercolor paper and my paint, which by the way, this watercolor sheet that I'm going to be working in today is 5 by 7 inches. So it is a perfect greeting card size. All right, just as an FYI, it's already cut. It's already pasted on my black cutting mat. This is just regular 1-inch masking tape. And if you're afraid that the tape is going to rip your paper, part of your paper off when you remove it at the end, all you have to do is weaken that adhesive by running your pieces of tape over your clothes a couple of times before taping down your watercolor sheet. I've never had any issues with regular masking tape, as long, of course, as you're using quality paper. Because if you're using cheaper, even thinner paper, of course, you can damage your paper more easily. Okay, when it comes to my paintbrushes, this is what I have on hand. I'm not sure if I'm going to use them all, but it is a mix of medium-sized brushes and smaller brushes. And these are all synthetics, and these are all relatively cheap within the cheaper watercolor paintbrush range, except this one. This one is from Princeton, from their Aqua Elite series. But all of these I get via Amazon. I think this one is from Blick, but I know that Amazon does sell some Zen brushes from Royal and Langnickel. But anyway, these are all round brushes. This is a size 14 round, and it is going to be important that you have a size 14 or a little bit larger for the background wash, because we are going to be painting the background for this one, and we want to be able to paint that nice and fast. And then this one is a size 8. This one is a size 6. This one is a 4. This one is a 0. And this one is a 3. Okay, these are all round brushes. All right. And you can see how this one does come to a nice fine tip. This one is a little bit pointier, but these all are not super fine at the tip there. All right, so there's that. If that makes you, I don't know. A lot of people are very specific. They want all their watercolor brushes to come to a nice fine tip. Not all of these come to a super fine tip, right? I really like this brush. I've had it for many years, and it was, I kid you not, like $3 when I got it. And I've been pretty rough with it, and I still use it. Okay, this is from Royal and Langnickel's Zen watercolor line. And you can find them, the entire line, over at blick.com. And I think even Michael's carries a whole bunch of these. Okay, so when it comes to my sketching supplies, I have this soft graphite eraser on hand. This is from a brand called Generals. Generals is my favorite brand of erasers. And when I say soft graphite eraser, all I mean is it's not one of those very hard plasticky erasers. It's very important, because I'm going to be erasing on watercolor paper, that I'm using something that is softer and it's not going to scratch or damage my paper if I use it on it, right? So go for a softer eraser. Oftentimes the packages will say soft eraser, or I like gum erasers as well, the really crumbly kind. And I know that a lot of people don't like them because it kind of frustrates them that pieces of your eraser are breaking off. But to be honest, because I erase on watercolor paper, I am fine with, a little bit of breakage is fine as long as I don't damage my watercolor paper. And I also love the way that the gum erasers smell. So there's that as well. For some strange reason, I've always liked that smell. And I also have this kneadable eraser. This is from a brand called Mr. Pen. And I got a package of these kneadable erasers a couple of years ago from Amazon. And it was a big package with like 14 or 16 little kneadable erasers, and they've been great. Okay. Kneadable erasers are great if you want to go into smaller areas to erase. But when I am preparing a preliminary sketch that I'm going to be applying watercolor on, I like oftentimes just dabbing, like going like this to remove excess graphite from my drawing that might be floating around on the surface of my paper that might muddy up or dull my colors. And I do know that there are artists out there that just leave a lot of graphite work under their watercolor. Uh, and that is fine. It's a style, it's a thing. You can go down that route. For me personally, I like keeping my drawing very light, and I like making sure that I either have a very small amount of graphite on my paper or remove it completely, as we're going to be doing today, before applying the watercolor washes, so that my watercolor can stay nice and vibrant and saturated, because graphite is gray and it can muddy up or murky up the vibrant colors. Of course, in realism, saturated colors don't really like there we only see a very small amount of saturated colors in realism, which is why if you're just using watercolor right out of the pen or tube, it doesn't lead to realistic results because those are very saturated colors. So it is very important to know how to desaturate colors, know about the color wheel, know about color mixing to desaturate colors intentionally if you're going for realistic results. However, I don't want my colors to become desaturated because there's graphite kind of blending into my paint, if you know what I mean. Okay. Hi, Gloria. Welcome. Arkansas. Amazing. Can you use Zen Cat's tongue brush for the background? I guess you can, Susie. I mean, I don't use cat's tongue brushes very much. I do have a couple here in my studio. You certainly can, and I can see its use and how it could be helpful for you because of its shape. You can go into like more complex, narrow areas more easily because of the shape of the brush. So you can, for me personally, when I'm painting a larger wash, cat's tongue brushes. Where do I have mine? Hold on. I wish I had mine on hand so that I can explain to people who don't know what a cat's tongue brush is. Okay, I have a smaller one here. I guess I can explain with this one. Okay, so this is a cat's tongue brush. Okay, so you can see how what an oval wash is also what some people call it. Maybe a cat's tongue sometimes comes to a finer tip than this, but it's kind of that shape, right? Where it's like a teardrop, if you will. So the thing with this kind of brush is that it is pretty flat, right? If you hold it up on its side, it's pretty flat. Whereas a round brush, it's very, what's the word? I don't know, round, fat, you know. The larger the brush, the more water and paint you're going to be able to hold in its bristles. It's going to be more absorbent. So, this is, as I said, it's not a large cat's tongue brush, but it's a half inch, right? So, if you use a larger cat's tongue brush, maybe it could be helpful, but just make sure that it is larger. I would not use anything like this size to paint a background, all right? The larger, the better to paint a background, essentially, because you're going to be able to load up more paint in those bristles and paint pretty fast. This is a very large round brush from Zen's Royal and Langnickel Zen watercolor line, okay? But I'm going to be using this one. This is a size 14 round. This is a large, what's it called? Wash brush. Okay, medium-sized wash brush or something like that is what they call them. Each brand tends to call their paintbrushes slightly different names or categorize them differently. Okay, but just uh, make sure that you're using a brush that is large enough for the size of the area that you're going to be painting in. Okay, so back to my sketching supplies. These are the pencils that I really enjoy using right now. I also enjoy sketching pencils from Derwent, but this is a great pencil line. 9,000 from now 9,000 drawing pencil line from Faber-Castell. And I would recommend using an HB pencil for your pencil sketch. Why? Because an HB pencil is kind of middle of the range between hard graphite and soft graphite. It's right in the middle. And you're going to be able to arrive at a light looking sketch that is easy to clean, easy to erase, and that you won't see through much through your watercolor paint. But of course, if you press down too hard, you're going to end up with a very dark drawing, okay? And that there is no way around it. You could be using a 4H pencil, and if you press down too much when you're drawing, you're going to scratch your paper and you're going to see those lines at the end, okay? So it doesn't matter how hard your graphite is in your pencil, you still need to develop your fine motor skills and the ability to draw lightly, which doesn't come easily. It comes through practice. The more you practice, the easier it becomes to draw lightly. The harder you draw, the harder it is to erase, and the more you're going to see your pencil lines at the end, and the more likely it is that you'll damage your paper. I would recommend using an HB pencil. Personally, I'm going to be using a 2B, but this is only because I want you to be able to see what I am doing, okay? The 2B pencil is going to show up just a little bit darker on screen so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. But if I were creating this drawing for myself, when I'm starting with a sketch that I'm going to be painting with watercolor, I always use an HB, okay? And if you're confused about different drawing pencil grades, what these little codes are on drawing pencils, I would recommend checking out my drawing supplies basics class for beginners that I have on my YouTube channel. I have a series of classes especially for people getting started with drawing and sketching, where I talk about basic supplies, what different drawing pencils are, and how they can come in handy throughout the drawing process. My drawing setup and why it is important to draw on a kind of tilted surface. And I even provide beginner exercises, how to simplify objects into shapes, how to go from two-dimensional shapes to three-dimensional voluminous forms. All of those I provide in that series of classes for beginners, okay? That's it. I have sharpened my 2B pencil. And what else do I have with me? I have a few of my Blue Scott absorbent towels, which is what I enjoy using when I'm painting with watercolor. Why do I like these? Because they are thin and they are untextured. Okay, so whenever I need to go in and do some lifting throughout the painting process, all I have to do is kind of wrap this towel around my fingers and go in and do this, and I won't be left with a ton of texture on my paper. Some people like using heavily textured towels when they're painting with watercolor, but if you were to go in and do some lifting, you're likely going to be left with texture because you're using a textured towel. So the towels all have their pros and cons. What is the con about this is that they get soaked pretty quickly, right? You're constantly dabbing your brush on your absorbent towel as you're painting, and every time it is soaking up more and more water. So you're likely going to have to change. I don't know, if I'm working on a full painting, oftentimes I go through 3 of these throughout the painting process. But what's cool is that they dry very quickly. So I just leave them on hanging from one of the sides of my desk or something, and maybe an hour later I can reuse them. So that's why I like these towels so much. And these are Blue Scott absorbent towels. The brand is Scott, I think. And these are just blue absorbent towels. You can get them in Pep Boys or I think even Michael's and stuff like that. And I also have my container with water, which I may change throughout the process depending on how murky it gets. so that, again, my colors can stay nice and vibrant. I think that's it in terms of, oh, my drawing pen. I'm going to be using this Unipin fine liner. This is from Mitsubishi Pencil Co. And this is one of my favorite drawing pens that I use with watercolor because it has ink that is permanent and smudge proof. It is very important that you use a pen or marker or whatever it is that has ink that is permanent and smudge proof, because you're going to be applying watercolor on top. Whenever you're going to be using a drawing pen in combination with a painting medium, you want to make sure that it won't budge, it won't smudge, it will dry quickly, etc. And my 3 favorite pens, all of which I get via Amazon, but throughout the last couple of years, I've just been using these Unipin fine liners. But 3 pens that I can recommend are Micron pens from Sakura, pigment liners from Staedtler, and these Unipin fine liners from Mitsubishi Pencil Co. And all of these you can get via Amazon. And if you're interested, I'm going to be using a 0.5 tip size. And this type of pen that I'm going to be using, or that I use for my drawings, is referred to as a technical drawing pen. Okay? It's not a brush pen. It's not a fine fountain pen nib type thing. It's just a simple, sorry, I have something on my hand, technical drawing pen. Okay, this is a round tip, fine tip. Okay, let me know if you have any questions on my supplies. And finally, as always, I have my sketchbook on hand with me right in front of me. This is a sketchbook from Strathmore. I get it via Amazon. I also like sketchbooks from Canson, drawing sketchbooks. And this is 9x12. And why do I have this on hand? Because oftentimes when I'm teaching classes and I want to explain a shape or something more in depth, I just pull this and I explain it. And it's nice to have it right here so that I can do that if I need to. Okay. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. I think that's all. The last little thing that I want to mention, and it goes hand in hand with what I was kind of explaining about the fragility. I don't know if that's the right word that I want to say, but this is also something that I have been like providing as a tip in the last couple of classes, is that if you're just getting started with drawing, you find that you're drawing too, like you're pressing down too hard a lot. You are erasing a lot. Maybe you're just nervous about drawing on watercolor paper. I would recommend creating that sketch first on your sketchbook, or even like a regular printing paper that you have around, and then transferring your sketch onto your watercolor sheet. Okay. That is something even I do when I'm going to be painting something that I haven't sketched in a while, or it's harder to sketch, or perspective is important, or proportions are important, like with a portrait or something like that. Even at this point in my journey, I still create my sketch separately and I transfer with a light box or with tracing paper. Tracing paper is still my favorite transferring method of choice. People ask me why I use tracing paper. I don't know. Like I really like it. I like it more than carbon paper. I know that it requires a couple of extra steps, but I like that I have that drawing on my tracing paper, so that I can reuse it as many times as I want, because I oftentimes work on a painting 2-3 times. Okay. So there's that. Okay. I just wanted to get that out there because, again, if you are drawing too hard or erasing too much on your watercolor sheet, it can definitely affect the outcome. Okay. Great. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me pop up this and let me know if you have any questions. Gloria, you're a Patreon member. Awesome. Thanks for letting me know. I love knowing who's a Patreon member. But even if you're just joining from YouTube and you want to use the chat and you want to ask questions, please know that I am here and I am always happy to help with whatever you might need. Okay? As long as your questions are art related in some way, of course. All right, cool. So pencil on hand, it's been sharpened. And this is the cute little teddy bear that we're going to be drawing. Now, I really like this idea for the teddy bear because it's a great opportunity for us to practice our block-in phase. What is the block-in phase? It is an essential foundational phase when you're sketching with, when you're freehand sketching anything, whether it's still life, a landscape, a face, an animal, like whatever it is that you're drawing. If you are creating a freehand drawing and starting from zero, completely freehand, you're going to start with a block-in phase. In this phase, we're just laying down these oversimplified and blocky, more geometric-y looking shapes so that we can focus on getting proportions right in terms of both, in this case, the teddy bear itself, like its head size in relation with its body and its limbs in relation with its body. Like that's what I'm talking about when it comes to proportions. We also, as I've been mentioning in the last few classes, is that we want to make sure that the subject is sitting on our picture plane or our sheet where we want it to sit, which is relatively centered in this case, and that its size is what we want it to be. Like those are the first things that I'm focusing on. Not getting perfect circles, not getting perfect ovals, not getting perfect shapes. No, this is a foundational stage where we just need to lay down these oversimplified shapes, maybe even lines, in order to decipher proportions, locations. And as I've been mentioning in all these classes, we always work from large to small, general towards specific. We simplify everything into basic shapes and keep your drawing light because we want it flexible in the beginning. Okay? All right, so let's just go ahead and get started. Where would I start in this case? I'm started with largest shapes, right? In this particular case, something that I find really helpful myself is I like drawing a couple of tick marks just to make sure that I am visualizing the total height of my subject here, okay? So that my large shapes that I create in my block-in can fit inside of this height. And it's also helpful to kind of visualize the width of your subject. Like, where do you want it to sit in your space, and how big do you want it to be in terms of both height and width, okay? And just set yourself up with a few tick marks so that you can visualize the space that you're going to be drawing in, okay? Maybe you watched some of my drawing videos and you've heard me mention the term envelope. That is essentially the block-in. You're simplifying everything into a very basic shape, sometimes a combination of basic shapes, depending on what you're drawing. But it's a very important phase that is going to help set you up for success and help you get those proportions right before moving on to the next things. So many beginners would just start drawing a perfect oval or stuff like that. But honestly, that's just going to make the process a lot harder. And you'll notice when you learn from people who are really good at drawing that they're usually, unless they're working on gestures and stuff like that, where it's all curves and very like, curved lines and ovals and shapes, usually people start with straight lines during their block-in, okay? All right, so if I want my teddy bear to fit within this space, and some people, you might even visualize, you don't have to draw this, but you might even visualize your teddy bear sitting in a rectangle, right? Okay, but once you already have this space that you want your teddy bear to fit in, now we can start drawing the shapes, oversimplified shapes inside of this. And I want you to ignore the scarf, ignore the hat, and try to see through, like if you were able to see through the scarf and through the hat, what would the edge of that shape look like? Okay, so if I were drawing say the belly area, the chest, belly, and bottom part of the torso of this bear, right? It would sit somewhere around here. And notice how I'm just bringing straight lines together as opposed to curves. But the belly would sit somewhere around here, okay? It would be around that size, and I'm just focusing on angles, like bringing together a series of angled lines in such a way that at the end, by combining these straight lines, it kind of looks like an oval, similar to what I'm observing there. I'm ignoring the scarf, I'm ignoring the legs, I'm ignoring the arms, okay? Because those are secondary forms, medium-sized forms that I'm going to be connecting to this. So first, I'm just trying to visualize the belly area itself. You can see how I left some space down here because the little feet are actually coming down a little bit past this edge, right? And just know that this is all flexible. I'm going to be refining, I'm going to be erasing. Maybe I don't reach this initial little tick mark. All that is fine, okay? We have to get comfortable laying down lines and shapes lightly so that we have different shapes to compare with in order to get proportions right. Because getting proportions right is all about getting the different parts making up the whole right. And how are you going to know if those different parts are going to look good together and be proportionate if you don't see them down on paper? There is no way. Like, I can't do magic. I need to see it on paper to see if I need to make it smaller or larger or make it a little bit, like, bring it a little bit more to the right or to the left. I need to get comfortable laying down shapes on paper. And you can see this in sketches by old masters. Look up some sketches from Da Vinci or Michelangelo or other old masters, sculptors or artists, and you'll see that they left these imperfect shapes and lines behind as they were creating their sketches. And then all they did so that the correct shapes were more visible at the end is they just went over them and created more contrast in those shapes. But even old masters, they didn't expect themselves to go in with perfect shapes right off the bat, okay? So please know that. Okay, so once that belly shape is in, what would that head shape look like? It's a little bit smaller than the belly, right? The head should be a little bit smaller than the belly. So let me get that in. And then if I need to make the belly area a little bit larger, I can do that. The head is here. The hat goes a little bit past that. Maybe I should bring down the head a little bit because the hat is just not going to fit if my head reaches that little tick mark at the top. So I'm going to bring down the headline and I'm just going to connect a series of straight lines and visualize that like kind of an oval shape for the head and make sure that the head is slightly smaller than the body, okay? In terms of both height and width. And width, okay? And sometimes you can even ask yourself, how many times would this head shape fit in the body? Is it 1.5? Is it 2? Right? What's cool about a teddy bear is that it's a stuffed animal. It's not a real bear, right? It's not like when we're drawing a face where proportions are very, very precise and we have to get them right because, you know, when it comes to drawing a face, you need to study facial proportions and what faces look like in real life. What is the structure of the head? Because if you just draw a face from imagination without having studied that, many times, even if you have a reference photo, you don't know what to look at and you still end up with a face that is not quite very believable, right? So proportions with anatomy, they're very precise, but this is a stuffed animal. So stuffed animals are not necessarily realistic. So if your head ends up being a little bit larger or a little bit smaller, a little bit wider, you know, that's fine. It's still going to look like a teddy bear. But if you were drawing a real bear, that's a different story. Or at least if you are going for more realistic results. Okay, so great. So those are the two main shapes in this teddy bear, right? The two largest shapes, if you will. Now we can start adding in the medium-sized shapes over this. So a pretty large shape that I see there is the scarf. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sketching that in here over the parts of these, the part of the head, the lower part of the head, and the upper part of the torso, where the scarf is kind of overlapped, covering up those body parts at least slightly. And with that, I can erase what I wouldn't be able to see of the body parts behind the scarf. All right, cool. Once you have this, we can start adding the hat. The hat is tilting. And when it comes to the hat, it is helpful to draw the ear because the ear is definitely an important part of this bear that we have to, proportions have to look okay, shape has to look okay. We have to know where the ear is connecting into the head so that we can place the hat effectively over the head and right next to the ear in a way that makes sense. And then we have kind of this part of the hat goes kind of like that. I'm going to dust these eraser bits off with my paper towel instead of doing it with my hand. I'm going to give you a minute or two. This is still the block-in phase, by the way. All of this is the block-in phase. Until all of your different body parts are in, it's still the block-in phase. After everything is in and proportions look okay and the size of the teddy bear is okay within my picture plane, then I can go ahead and add the smaller details and refine my shapes, maybe make them a little bit more curved. But I'm going to continue with my medium-sized shapes. And have a sip of coffee and give you a minute. Let me know if you have any questions or are having trouble with anything. I seem to have no questions. How's it going? All right, so I seem to have no questions. Let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow. I'll move faster. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to continue with my medium-sized shapes, the little feet. I want to, at any point, the more little shapes you add into your drawing, the more points of comparison you're going to have, the more landmarks you're going to have to compare other shapes with or to. Okay. So it's totally normal to want to fix a previous shape a little bit when you add in a new shape, okay? Because all of a sudden you notice this needs to be a little bit larger, this actually needs to be a little bit smaller. So in my case, I'm gonna make the belly area just a little bit taller, okay? But I'm gonna start with my feet. So these feet, I'm also going to be using a combination of, or a series of straight lines brought together to draw these little feet, okay? This is still a block-in. And if your feet are a little bit asymmetrical, that's totally okay because gravity does exist. So sometimes when you're seeing a stuffed animal, a little one of its little limbs is falling slightly differently from the other. Okay, so it's not like perfect symmetry is not absolutely necessary for this. Last week when we were drawing our snow globe, symmetry was very important because that is a very perfectly symmetrical man-made object. But stuffed animals have different body parts, which are movable, if you will. So it's totally fine if these are not perfectly symmetrical in terms of their angle, right? But you do want them to look like they are the same size, or at least very, very close in size. But the orientation of the shape itself can be a little bit different. Hope that that makes sense. Once I have this, I can start adding in the circle for the belly. We are going to use a lighter brown and a darker brown in the teddy bear's body. And I want this belly section to be a lighter brown. So it's going to be a nice opportunity to practice our color mixing. And then the arms are just, they're going to be, this one over here is going to be partially hidden behind the scarf. So I'm just going to create a shape there. And it would be over the body, so I can erase that. And this scarf section is coming down like that. Partially hiding one of the edges of the arm. And then there's this little scarf section here as well. Gonna give you a couple of minutes. Let's see if I have any questions. I don't seem to have any questions. The other arm is more visible, so I'm gonna start with the outer edge, and then how would it be covering this part of the belly chest area? I wouldn't be able to see that edge there. Maybe it's a little bit too large. I'm gonna fix that. There we go. Just doing any final refinements of my larger shapes before moving on to the next. What is overlapping what? What is the scarf covering? What edges wouldn't I be able to see because there's this object covering up, or part of the body covering up this other part of the body, right? Always consider the overlapping. What edges can I see? What edges can't I see? Does the size of this part look consistent or proportionate with this other part of the body? Do I want to make it larger? Do I want to make it smaller? Like, I feel, for example, that my head can be a little bit larger, just a little, than what I have here. Now that I see the body drawn. Is there anything that you want to refine or change when it comes to proportions before moving forward? Does the bear look too tall? Does the bear look too short? I think I have a couple more medium-sized shapes to add in. And then I would start with the smallest shapes, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, all of that. I can start adding in the red, what's going to be the red section of the hat. And this is fabric and it's hanging down, so I do have to have gravity in mind when I'm drawing this shape. The shape, fabric, in a way, fabric is more, I approach drawing fabric more like I approach drawing organic objects from nature, like trees, flowers, rocks, clouds, in that shapes are very irregular and there is no symmetry to them. There is a lot of irregularity, fabric folds, and all that. So, as long as you have gravity in mind and how it's falling to the side and all this, it'll be fine. Let me know if you need a little bit more time or if I can move forward to these smaller shapes. How are you guys doing? I'm going to erase my first tick marks because I don't need them anymore. Maybe my scarf shape can be a little bit wider. Okay, I seem to have no comments, so I'm gonna go ahead and continue onto the smaller shapes. So when it comes to the smaller shapes, we have this little ball here at the end of this hat. We have a little, like the inner ear, outer ear separation going on here. We also have the stripes in the scarf, which I made sure to make slightly curved because since the scarf is wrapping around kind of a curved section of the body, we have to make sure that we account for the fact that it is wrapping around a curve. So it would create curved lines. If I were to just draw straight lines in the scarf, which is oftentimes what my brain is going to automatically tell me to do, because our brains are always going to go back to doing the drawing things in the simplest way it knows how, which is often drawing things straight when they're actually not, or also creating outlines where we actually don't see them. Of course, in this case, we are creating outlines because this is a line and wash piece. But when you're trying to achieve higher levels of realism, there are no outlines in real life around us. And oftentimes, our brain is going to tell us to create an outline to separate things from each other, like to understand what is our subject, what is the background, what is the arm, what is the leg, what is the eye, what is the face, what is this bottle, what is this box. Like our brain will automatically want to set the limits so that we can easily understand where one thing ends and the other begins. And the way that it does that is by creating outlines, when in reality we have edges and they sometimes get lost. So uh, the other day when I was chatting with one of my students, and I reminded her that learning to draw, like we're not born knowing how to draw. And in order to learn how to draw and develop drawing skills, we have to learn to override oftentimes things that come naturally to us as humans. Um, and so the more that you draw, the more you understand that sometimes you need to like override or ignore what your brain is telling you to do when you stop observing reference photos or things that you have in front of you in real life that you're trying to draw or paint. That's when your brain is going to start doing things automatically. And if you're not careful, it's going to go back to doing things in the easiest way it knows how. So how do you do that? You learn to intentionally override those things and observe, actually practice your observational skills to see what things look like in real life and avoid doing those things that are not going to lead to the realistic results that you're after. And it all comes down to knowing it's going to happen and observing your reference photo. Don't stop observing. Okay, let's see. All right, cool. So people seem to be doing okay. Great. So what I'm just missing a few extra shapes here in the little feet. So I have an extra oval, which I am once again creating by bringing together a series of straight lines. I'm not trying to create an oval. Just noticing, getting in a shape that when seen from farther back would seem like an oval, but it's actually just a series of straight lines brought together. And then from here, maybe I want to like flatten out my hat here a little bit. My shape maybe looks a little bit weird. I think that's better. Okay, so the face, I'm going to start by creating the little muzzle, the snout, and making sure that I know where that sits. I'm going to bring out the snout a little bit into the scarf so that it seems like this volume for the snout that is coming forward is slightly, ever so slightly, covering up the top of the scarf in this middle section. Right? Do you notice that? How the snout is going to slightly cover the top of the scarf? Maybe just a couple of millimeters. I can erase that part of the snout. And then I'm just gonna add the two eyes. And these are more like cartoon eyes because it is a stuffed animal. There are many types of eyes when it comes to teddy bears. Button eyes and smaller eyes and larger eyes. So feel free to give this bear your own spin, give it its own personality. If you want to make it cuter and you want to make larger eyes or something like that, by all means, go ahead and do it. When it comes to something like this, I like to think of the size of the eyes and how close or how far apart they are. Usually, if an eye is larger, there's going to be like a cuter vibe to your drawing or to your bear in this case. And placing your eyes a little bit farther apart may make it look a little bit more innocent. So there's that. It all depends what personality you want to give your bear. Or if you just want to kind of go with what I'm doing, that's fine too. I did try to leave a teeny tiny highlight in each of the eyes, and they are not in the center of the eye. They are a little bit kind of, I placed them within that circle of the eye, but like closer to the upper right corner of the circle of the eye, if you will. They are not necessarily meant to be pupils, they are meant to be highlights. So, what I am visualizing are just like semicircles that are kind of stuck on the head shape. And when you have a semicircle, you have like a curved structure like that, right? And if it is, say, a shiny or reflective material, like, say, plastic or something like that, it's going to reflect light that is hitting it. So I am just visualizing the light as being on the upper right, maybe. And in that case, I would slightly change the cast shadow, maybe to be a little bit more to the left. So wherever you want to place your highlights in your eyeballs, but I would definitely recommend placing your highlights wherever you want them, whether it's in the center of the circle or on the upper left or the upper right. Just make sure that you're keeping them consistent in both eyes so that it can look like the light is hitting the bear from a certain part, and lighting can be consistent just throughout the little illustration, if that makes sense. I'm going to add in those stripes in this part of the scarf and just one over here. And then when it comes to the nose, I'm just doing I'm going to draw this shape a little bit larger for you in my sketchbook so that you can actually see it better. Hold on. It's kind of a shape that is curved at the top and like that. So for these smaller elements, you might have noticed that I am going in and drawing little circles and curves. And that is because I don't want to have to go in and refine these because they are very small. And it would just be a little bit of a mess if I went in to erase because they're just so small. So I would rather just get them in like I want them from the beginning. But it is a shape like this, okay? Curve at the top, and then straight line, straight line, straight line, straight line. We are way past our block-in by this point, by the way, because we're already getting into smaller details. I've started refining some shapes, etc. The block-in phase is just that very beginning part of the process where you're creating those larger I guess you could say, most important shapes that you are going to be building on. And it's essentially that beginning phase where you're focusing on proportions and size and locations and all that before moving on to refining and adding details. Once you have your snout and your nose drawn in, just draw the little mouth area or opening of the mouth. And I do want to make it look like the teddy bear is smiling, so I make sure to curve the lines to the left and to the right, like little hooks coming out from the center of the nose. And that is it for the teddy bear. Set this aside. We're all done with the teddy bear, and if there's anything that you want to change, you can change it, but also have in mind that there are things that you can do with the pen and ink straight away. Just go in with the pen and ink and do. And you don't necessarily have to have every single detail drawn out with pencil before going in with the pen and ink. I think the more confident you become with your drawing and with drawing with pen, um, the less you have to do in pencil and the more you can do right away with your drawing pen. What piece was it that we did? We did the bells, we did the gingerbread house, and we did the snow globe. So I think it was the snow globe where we added in those little evergreen trees. And when I explained the block in phase in that one, I just explained, I think even in the gingerbread house, I explained how as we were creating our pencil sketch, we just did this for the trees, right? Where we were just simplifying the different layers of the evergreen trees as these like triangular, or what's the word? Is it a trapezoid looking shape? But then when we actually went in with the pen and ink, we didn't trace the flat geometric shapes. What we did was we created a regularity with varied marks and just used that initial pencil sketch as guide to help us arrive at an overall shape that is going to lead to the look of that triangular tree shape and its individual like layers of leaves. But what I'm getting at is we're going to be doing a similar thing with this teddy bear to communicate the illusion of fur. We're not going to trace a smooth line around those shapes, especially not in the furry areas, right? Because the same as with this tree, if I had just gone in and done this, it may end up looking like more of a stylized abstract tree, but it's not really going to convey that texture created by the leaves of the tree. To create textures, we use our pen in different ways, right? You vary your lines, you vary your marks, you use broken lines and a lot of that kind of thing. And it really helps to loosen up your hand, your wrist, your arm, scribble, you know. It really helps to do just maybe fill up a section of your page doing little exercise with a drawing pen before going in so that you can make sure that you are going in with looser lines and marks, especially because this is a textured subject. Like all of the materials here are soft fabrics with texture to them, like fur, right? Like an animal. So we don't want to go in and just create like a smooth line around those shapes. And as we're tracing, we're just using our pencil lines as a guide to visualize the overall shapes. And then we're going in with lines and marks that will help us describe that fur texture. Does that make sense? And then we added little like textural lines inside of the evergreen trees, kind of like this. But that's the same thing we're going to be doing here. It's just a teddy bear. But I still have a couple more things that I need to add in. First, we have the cast shadow shape. And I'm going to add it maybe slightly more to the left. Maybe a little bit comes into the right, but more of it goes into the left. And I'm not really adding in the edge for the surface of the table or whatever this bear is sitting on, but just for you to know, I am visualizing the edge of the table to be around here, okay? So when I drew this cast shadow shape, I am thinking first of where the table line is, which would essentially be the horizon line. If I were drawing a scene, it is important to visualize where that would be, right? But I don't want to actually add it into this little composition though. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in the little lights. Okay. So for the little lights, depending, like you do not have to copy my lights exactly, okay? Because the lights are what I would consider to be a secondary supportive set of elements, right? What does that mean? It's like the filler that is going to support and make this central focal point shine. They are going to add interest to the piece, but I don't want them to distract or take away from the central point, which is the teddy bear. And so when it comes to secondary elements, you have to see what is happening for you in your drawing when it comes to the main focal point, and then build the secondary things around it in a way that is going to help make it shine. And an example that I often bring up is, say, a flower bouquet. Whether you're actually creating like a physical flower bouquet at a shop or something, or you're painting a flower bouquet, it doesn't really matter. But there is a hierarchy in flower bouquets and in compositions, okay, where you choose which flowers are going to be the most important flowers, maybe the largest flowers, the flowers that you want the viewer to see immediately, okay? Those are the most important ones in the bouquet. And then you have the secondary flowers, which are maybe medium-sized flowers that you choose based on your primary flowers that you've already started with, right? You have to have those primary flowers, their shape, their color, their texture, their location in mind when you're choosing the secondary ones, because they're meant to support the primary ones. And then after the secondary ones, you have the tertiary elements, which in a bouquet would be the filler, like the grasses and maybe the teeny tiny flowers that you add in as filler in between to make it look fuller, right? But all of that is supportive to the primary and then the secondary. So when you're adding in the secondary flowers and the filler, you are adding it in to add and to support the primary flowers, right? You don't want to distract, you don't want them to take away, you don't want them to be super stark to the point that the viewer does no longer sees the main flowers, right? So you always have to have the most important elements in mind. The lights are those supportive elements in this case. So if for some reason your bear ended up being a little bit more to the right or to the left, a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, your hat is sitting a little bit differently from mine, it doesn't really matter. But think about these things as you are creating these lines. First, your lines where the lights are going to be attached. I want to make them slightly curved instead of like perfectly stiff and straight because curved lines are just going to lead to a more playful, mm, more what word is the one that I'm looking for? Like um, more movement, more of a dynamic final result than say straight lines. But maybe in this particular case, I want to do this other line a little bit more to the right than what I have in my original sketch because no two freehand drawings are going to be exactly the same, right? Not even mine. Sometimes not even when you're transferring a drawing, right? So I just want to encourage you when you're thinking of secondary and tertiary elements to add in to make the piece look fuller or more interesting, always consider what you already have, always consider the focal point. And finally, with these little lights, I'll sketch out the shape that I drew for these little lights in my sketchbook in just a moment. But I'm gonna add them here, maybe two on this side, one here. And remember that these lights, they're gonna be blooms over a gray background. So we're gonna have some fun with color when we get to that. And maybe two over here. You know what? I'm going to add a third one because I just think things are looking too patterny. I don't want to have two in every single section. Maybe I add in one here, and then the other is just partly visible here. Maybe a little bit cropped. Let me share what my combination of shapes for my, oops, bumped into my camera. Sorry about that. My shape for my lights, my shapes are just like a rectangle. And then I created like a diamond. That's all I did. Hi, Laura. Laura. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Yes, it's a sweet, fluffy Christmas bear that we're drawing. I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes. And let me know if you have any questions, anything at all that you'd like to ask. I'm here to help. We're about to get into our pen and ink phase. So pen and ink is a permanent medium, and I do like making sure that I like my sketch or at least have created a solid foundation to add to before moving on to the pen and ink. But I will be providing some essential pen and ink drawing tips. I do really enjoy drawing with pen and ink. I have to create many more tutorials in this upcoming year for sure, because I've kind of moved away from pen and ink, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, not intentionally. but I really enjoy it. Do make sure, as a reminder, that you're using a pen that has permanent and smudge proof ink. Because otherwise, when you paint on top of that ink, it's going to start smudging. You don't want that. Okay, I'm going to set this aside. Grab my drawing pen and a couple of tips with the pen. Okay. The first thing is keep your ink flowing. So, to do this, simply make sure that you're continuing to move your hand and arm as you are laying down your ink. Okay. Because if you're moving too slowly or you stop mid-line and restart, you can be left with these start and stop marks throughout your lines, okay? And another thing that happens when you are drawing too slowly is that your lines end up looking very stiff and unnatural, okay? It's preferable that you have wobbles and imperfections in your lines and marks, but have your lines and marks look flowy and dynamic and interesting than having very stiff, like perfect lines. Okay. That is going to lead to more dynamic and interesting results if you keep it flowing, right? And what else do I have to say before getting started? Okay. Something else is make sure that you have overlapping of elements or shapes or forms in mind as you are laying down the ink. Because if you go over a certain edge of a shape that actually wouldn't be visible because there's something in front of it, you're not going to be able to erase it. Okay. What can I provide as an example? Say, this ear is in front of this part of the hat, right? It's partially covering up a little section of the hat. So if for some reason I continue this line down, or maybe you haven't erased your line work that you no longer need and you just mindlessly continue tracing over that, you might end up tracing over a line or a section of the shape that you wouldn't really be able to see or shouldn't be able to see at the end, and you're not going to be able to erase that. So what I like doing is going a section at a time and just making sure that I understand what I'm going to be tracing over before starting, right? Because again, if you don't pay attention and you go on autopilot, what does your brain do? It goes back to completing shapes. It goes back to creating straight lines and outlines and easy shapes that it understands, which are often symmetrical geometric shapes. And these are very organic, irregular shapes. So, bring your mind into it, focus on what you're doing, and take mini breaks. Don't let your brain just tune out and go on autopilot, because that's when you start making mistakes. And little mistakes are fine. They can even make your piece give it more personality. But larger mistakes, you're not going to be able to fix, or at least make look less noticeable at the end. So stay in the process, take little breaks, and don't let your brain go on autopilot as you go. Okay? Great. So I'm just going to start with my background lines. You can start anywhere. If you're afraid that you might smudge your ink, you can decide to jump around accordingly or move left to right or right to left if you are left-handed. It's up to you. I've never had any issues with this pen, any smudging or anything like that. I do try not to fully rest my hand on my paper as I'm drawing in order to avoid any smudging. So there's that. But just be careful. Be careful and jump around the piece. And at this point in the process, you can certainly try to create smoother curves when you are tracing around elements like the lights, for example. I think I am missing a light right here behind the ear, and I'm just gonna draw it in with a pen, with pen. Uh, there it is. I'm just gonna draw it in with that pen. And then I'm just gonna continue here with my little lights. And here I have another one. Here. But yeah, you can start curving out shapes if you don't want them to be as geometric, as blocky. But now with the bear, I'm using more so these kinds of lines and marks. Okay, so if say, hold on, if say this is the edge of my arm, right? I'm not just tracing a smooth line around the edge of my arm. I'm creating more so marks. Okay, and sometimes my lines don't even join together. Like if I were to erase this, my pencil work, you'll see that they don't even meet in certain points, right? That is what I'm going to do throughout the bear. There's no need to overdo it with the fur texture either. Less is more. Just relax your hand and your arm. And if broken lines happen, that's fine, okay? Let them be. Let's see if I have any comments or questions. It is my favorite style. Awesome. Glad you like it, Melinda. Yes, please, more pen and ink. Awesome, Paul. Thanks so much for sharing. I always like knowing what you're into and what you want to see more of. Really helps me out. Okay. Even the little snout is going to have irregular textural lines around it. This is also a very fluffy material here in the hat, which is going to be a white section. So I'm going to make sure to use those textural marks throughout that edge as well. The little fluffy ball over here, which is going to be white as well. Maybe textural lines that are not as irregular in the scarf because it is a soft material, but maybe not as fluffy as the fur itself. Almost done. The cast shadow shape can be a little bit smoother, but I do want it to look quite abstract on the surface there. And the red part of the hat, what's going to be the red part of the hat, is also more like the scarf, where I do want some irregularity throughout it, but not like too much texture like the fur areas. Okay, now I'm going to trace around the eyes. And I'm going to trace around the teeny tiny highlight shape as well. There you go. That's it. As a little extra, if you would like to add more detail, you can certainly feel free to create a few textural marks inside your shapes after you're done tracing around the shapes. Just make sure that you don't go overboard, okay? Because we will be developing some depth with the watercolor. And as I said at the top of this class, at the start of this class, we don't want to do too much with pen and then too much with watercolor, because if we do that, it's going to look overworked at the end. We want to make this look expressive, loose, like an easy style, right? A fresh style. Maybe not easy, but like a freshness to it, right? And if you do too much with both mediums, you're going to get rid of that freshness. So just add a few. A little bit goes a long way. Maybe some in the face, little teeny tiny marks. And that's it. I'm going to give this ink a few minutes to dry, and then I'm going to erase that. In the meantime, I'm going to swatch out the paint colors that I'm going to be bringing in for you so that you can see what they look like. Oh, as like a little thing that you could do if you wanted to, or you could do later. Doesn't really matter when you do this. But if you do it later, just make sure that your paint is completely dry, because we will be painting this, right? But however it is that you want to add in your handwritten lettering, if you are going to be, because you don't have to, but you know, throughout the series, we have been adding a little message, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever you would like to add here. Depending on the amount of space you have left over, which is why I left this space here, because we usually add in, like we've been adding in these messages. But however much space you have here, you can decide how you want to add in your handwritten lettering, right? You can decide to add in your message in a curve, like format, right? In which case, I would recommend drawing a curve or maybe tracing around something circular, right? Whatever makes sense for you. Personally, with the space I have left, I feel like I should do 2 lines. Maybe do, and you can feel free to use a ruler to create straight lines, but make sure that you are not drawing these lines, you know, too dark. I want to keep these lines that I create with my ruler light as well, just like everything else that I did in pencil. Oftentimes what I see, even myself, it happens to me if I'm not careful, again, if I let my brain and hands go on autopilot, when I'm using a ruler, because we usually press down with our ruler so that it doesn't move as we're using it, we tend to go in and press down with this other hand as well. And we end up with lines that are very dark and with lines that have a very different line quality from the lines that we create when we're drawing freehand with no ruler. So when you are bringing in a ruler for, say, something like this, just make sure that you're drawing your lines lightly, okay? All right, so that's the last thing. Let me go ahead and share my paint colors with you that I'm going to bring in. And I did provide some substitutes in the beginning of this video for the paint colors in case you don't have these. But let me go through them again. Hold on, let me pull up my color list so that I can make sure to use these colors that I have planned. Okay. All right, so let's start with Azo Yellow Deep, which is the warm yellow that I have here on my palette, which if you are just getting started with watercolor and you want some guidance when it comes to what paint colors to choose and how to organize them on your palette and whatnot, I do have a video on my channel where I explain the split primary method, which is the method that I go by. It's super versatile because when you go with a split primary palette, you can essentially paint whatever you want with just really just a few colors. I've added in a few more than my initial split primary palette that I started with, but as long as you have a warm and cool version of each primary of your yellows, reds, and blues, and you have a couple of maybe neutrals. For example, I really enjoy having yellow ochre, burnt umber, and burnt sienna on my palette as my neutral browns. Um, but you can decide to bring in your own whatever neutrals you enjoy, and even if you want like a secondary color like a undersea green, which as I said is a green that I really love from Daniel Smith, but you stem from the split primary palette, which is just having those 6 base colors, a warm and cool version of each primary, and you just add a few colors that you feel you enjoy and that make your painting process more, um, I guess, practical, right? And just colors that you really really found that you enjoyed, you can bring those in and add to those 6. But stemming from that split primary palette is key, in my opinion. Okay, so this is Azo Yellow Deep, which is a warm yellow. Okay. If you don't have, let me make sure that this is sitting on screen. Yes. Okay. Sorry about that glare. Let me try to make this less glary for you. Okay. Please explain about the jagged edges of the bear. Okay, I'll explain that again, Susan. So, okay. The way that I created the marks along the edges of the bear's body to convey that fur texture is by doing this kind of line and mark. It's not super planned. These are kind of marks that that help me convey the texture that I'm trying to render, to create, to draw, right? It's the same way when you are painting with watercolor and you're trying to paint textures. You change the way you're using your brush, right? If you are painting, say, a cat, the way that you're using your brush has, like, you have to have in mind that fur growth, the direction of the fur growth, the length of the fur, right? All of these characteristics, and then you change the way you're using your brush, right? You create like shorter strokes or longer strokes, the direction of your strokes, and whether they are slight curves or stronger curves. All of like the way that you're using your brush, the strokes have to change depending on the texture that you're trying to paint, right? So the same thing goes when you're using a drawing tool. You have to all of a sudden vary your lines and marks, having that texture in mind. And in this case, it's a teddy bear, so it's similar to, sorry, there's some like ambulance going by, if you hear that. So you have to have in mind the direction of the fur and the length of the fur throughout the animal's body, or in this case, the teddy bear, and change the way that you're using your pen and you're creating those little teeny tiny marks, right? So it's nothing super planned, but I do have those characteristics in mind as I am doing this. And I would highly recommend, if you've never done this before, if you're still feeling like very stiff when you're drawing with a pen, something that really, really helped me is filling up pages with lines and shapes and marks, right? And that will give you more control over your drawing pen. And even just doing, like, imagine you're signing a document. Imagine you're signing something, right? This kind of thing allows you to loosen up. If you've never done this before, I would highly recommend it, because you need to know, it will help you get more like faster and confident with your pen, but you also need to explore this in order to fully know what marks you're able to create with your tool. If you never make time for this exploration work, how are you going to know, right? So, in many, many ways, it helps your confidence, it helps you work faster, but it also helps you explore what you can do with your tools. And for like, that is the kind of mark that I used. And so, essentially, I think it's Susan, yes, Susie. You draw your shapes with a pencil, right? Let me grab my 2B pencil. Like, you draw your shape. Let's just say that this is the bear's head with the ear. This is just going to do it very fast here. The other ear, right? So when I created my preliminary sketch, these are smooth shapes, relatively smooth shapes, right? Of course, I actually brought a series of straight lines together, and right there I drew more of a circle or oval, whatever it is. But when you're going in with your drawing pen, you're not just tracing around the shape, because if I did that, it's not going to help me convey that texture. And edges are very important when you're trying to convey textures. What I explained over here with the tree is I'm not going to go around my shapes and trace around my shapes with a smooth line. This is a smooth line right here, right? That is not going to look natural or believable. If you're looking for more of a stylized, illustrative kind of look, that's fine. That's something else. But if you're going for a little bit more realism and a little bit more like you want to convey texture, you have to trace, right? I'm using the word trace loosely, but I'm just using my pencil lines as a guide to create my textural marks around that shape, right? Even if you are going to be drawing, say, a piece of wood, right? Hold on. Let's just say you're drawing wood, and this is a plane. I'll get back to the drawing of the bear in just a bit. Let's just say this is a what's it called? What is the proper term? Like a sheet of wood, or maybe it's a little bit too thick to be a sheet, but you know what I mean, like a block of wood. I'm not going to go in and just do a smooth edge, because at least if I want it to look like rustic wood, the edges wouldn't be smooth. They would have imperfection throughout them, right? So it's a different kind of texture from fur, but you want those edges to have I hope it's dry, like a certain level of imperfection to them, depending on the texture that you're trying to render, right? If I want it to look like rustic wood, not the like smooth kind that has been sanded and whatnot, I'm gonna think of an edge that is gonna help me convey that type of texture. And a smooth edge is not, because edges are super important when you're conveying texture, right? A smooth edge is not going to allow me to do that. So once I have my edges in, then I can think of what marks I'm going to be adding inside to help me convey that wood, right? But edges are key when you're trying to communicate textures. So key. And so because pen and ink is permanent, like you have to go in with a strategy and knowing what mark making techniques you're going to be using. In this case, because this is a teddy bear, I'm thinking of like a fur texture, right? So when I am drawing animals, I have to think of the direction of that fur growth, the length of that fur length and direction change throughout an animal's body, by the way. So again, we have to look at references to get that visual information. But this is more the textural mark that I am applying over my pencil, right? Let me erase now my pencil work here so that you can see what this looks like. And you'll know that it's very similar to this, right? It's not quite a scribble. It's more little marks, tapered lines and marks. glossy. Does that make sense, Susie? Did I answer your question? I'm gonna set this aside and I'm gonna continue with my swatching of my colors. Okay. So Azo Yellow Deep. Hold on. Let me provide some alternatives for you if you don't have this color. Okay. Close this pen before my tip dries. So if you don't have Azo Yellow Deep, you can use Hansa Yellow Deep, New Gamboge, Indian Yellow, Cadmium Yellow Deep, or even regular Cadmium Yellow. Okay. Now let me go ahead and swatch out the next color. This is Sap Green. Sap Green is a warm green. Okay, it looks like this. If you don't have Sap Green, you can use olive green, hooker's green, undersea green, phthalo green yellow shade, not blue shade, because phthalo green blue shade is cool. Phthalo green yellow shade is warm. Okay. You can also use green apatite. And then from there, I'm also going to be bringing in burnt umber, which is a chocolatey brown. Looks like this. Whoops, I got some brown on my paper here. If you don't have burnt umber, you could use Mars Brown, Sepia, Van Dyke Brown, Transparent Brown Oxide, Permanent Brown, Brown Iron Oxide, or anything similar to this. The next color that I'm going to be bringing in, or at least swatching for you, is Permanent Red Light, which is a warm red. It looks like this. Let me make sure that this is showing on screen. One sec. Okay. Permanent Red Light is a warm red. And if you don't have Permanent Red Light, you can use Cadmium Red Light, Scarlet Lake, Pyrrole Scarlet, Organic Vermilion, Mayan Orange, or anything similar. And then finally, I'm going to be bringing in Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray is a cool blue biased gray. And the level of coolness or how blue it looks is really going to vary from brand to brand. Okay. What I have noticed, for example, I'm going to remove the little teddy bear image from the screen so that you can see how often I'm using my water and dabbing on my absorbent towel in just a bit when we get to the painting. If you don't have Payne's Gray, you could use even neutral tints, Jane's Gray, neutral black if you absolutely have to, or if any ready-made black if you absolutely have to. You can consider adding in a touch of blue if you do go with a ready-made black. So what I was going to say is that Payne's Gray, their level of blueness really varies from brand to brand. For example, this is Payne's Gray from Van Gogh, right? If I were to swatch out my Payne's Gray from Winsor & Newton's professional line, you'll notice that that almost looks like an indigo. It's so blue, okay? So just know that, right? Colors vary from brand to brand, but what I always explain to students is that what's most important for you to understand if you're just getting started with painting, if you're a total beginner, it's a lot more important for you to learn about the color wheel, to learn about primary and secondary colors, to get really comfortable with color mixing, to understand color temperature, and all this important essential color theory, because color theory is an art fundamental, right? As with as is light behavior, as is composition, as is perspective, as is 3D form, right? It's essential for you to understand about this art fundamental as a art fundamental topic, instead of you getting overwhelmed about specific paint colors. Sorry, there's like a plane or something going by. I'm going to wait for it to pass. Hold on. Okay. You're very welcome, Susie. Okay. Thanks for your question, by the way. So, what I was getting at is that it is very important for you to understand all of that first before getting overwhelmed with characteristics of specific paint colors. What I see in a lot of beginners is that sometimes I've had students where they become so overwhelmed with watercolor particular colors characteristics and like understanding specific colors individually that, I kid you not, they spend entire years just swatching paint colors and like creating all of these color charts with all of these individual colors, pigment codes and opacity and translucency and staining qualities and all of these things for a gazillion different paint colors. And for what? For what? Why are you trying to understand paint colors? It's to paint complete little compositions, to paint color, to use colors in combination, right? You're not going to be using colors in isolation. You have to, the more you actually create paintings, and mix colors together and use them in combination, the more you're going to understand color and learn color. So instead of getting yourself overwhelmed with all of that, which really makes no sense for the beginner to get into, in my personal opinion, understand color theory, because that is going to set you up for success. And if you understand color theory, you understand the difference between warm and cool colors and all this, it's going to be so easy for you to just replace colors that, say you're following one of my tutorials or someone else's tutorials and they're using a warm red. Just by seeing the red, you're going to be able to know what to reach for if you don't have that red, because you understand what kind of red it is, right? You understand, I don't have that specific red, but I have this other warm red, so I can replace that easily. But if you don't understand color temperature, you're going to continue depending on people telling you exactly what to use. And you're never going to be able to make decisions on your own. So that is why understanding color theory is so important. And yes, of course, cadmium red is a little bit more opaque than whatever other red and whatever. Like, yes, when it comes to watercolor, especially, different paint colors do have slightly different qualities. Some are more opaque than others. Some are more granulating than others. Some are more staining than others. Yes, I'm not saying they're not. However, those are more advanced, like fine tuning things that you can decide to change paint colors or replace colors. Like if you say you like this green but you want more of a granulating effect, but you learn that you really love warm greens because you're using a sap green and you love it, right? But you want to have a green in your palette that is more granulating. Oh, okay, so I can look up a green color that is more granulating, say like undersea green from Daniel Smith is a warm granulating green where you're going to have more modeling, more separation as it dries. Cool. Now you know, now you can add the undersea green or explore other granulating paint colors. Or say you're loving the lifting technique where you can remove some color from your watercolor um, paper after you've applied it, right? You love the lifting technique. And because you do love lifting, you want to go with more less staining watercolor paint that can be more easily lifted off. Okay, cool. So replace your staining colors with your non-staining versions of that color. right? Cool. But that is fine tuning that you personally need to discover works for you for the specific results and techniques that you enjoy. Because if you just continue going by what other artists are telling you to add to your palette, well, that's their style, that's their techniques, that's their tastes. You need to discover the specific characteristics of colors that work for your techniques, right? So if you stem from an understanding of color theory, that is the basis, that is the foundation, that is going to set you up for success. You understand colors intimately, you understand their relationships because you understand the color wheel and all of this that I mentioned before. Stem from that. Paint a lot. Learn what techniques and styles and outcomes you personally enjoy. Then make your own decisions in terms of specific characteristics for different colors and build your palette slowly over time based on those personal discoveries. That is how you build a palette that is based on your taste, not someone else's, right? And of course, as I said before, I would recommend going with a split primary method because you'll have a warm and cool version of each primary and you're going to be able to paint anything, which is super practical. But inside of those, if you're going to have a warm red and a cool red, you have so many options of warm and cool reds that you can choose depending on what you enjoy in terms of those specific qualities, the staining, the granulation, the opacity, and all that. You can choose yourself. As long as you have a warm red and a cool red, you can choose, right? And it's not going to be until you explore color and you paint a lot and you paint different paintings from scratch, you go through the process, that you discover what you enjoy. Okay? Please, please, please don't get overwhelmed. Oh my God, what specific color are you using? Because I'm not going to be able to arrive at great results. Well, no, learn color theory and understand that these are easily replaceable. You can use whatever you have. Like, yes, it is important to have the primaries. Yes, of course. But if you understand the basics, you can easily replace them. So stem from understanding color theory. I hope that that makes sense. I just went on a wild rant because I meet so many people and it's always the same questions, always the same overwhelm. I have 60 different colors in my studio and I don't understand, like, I'm so overwhelmed. Keep it simple. Stem from the fundamentals. You don't need a gazillion different paint colors to arrive at great results. Okay? I hope that that makes sense. All right, so I'm gonna erase all of my pencil work, not these, only the pencil work and the bear and the lights. And I'm gonna dust it off with one of my clean towels and dry towels so that I don't go over this with my hand that I applied lotion on a while ago. There we go. So it's just ink in this entire section right now. Okay, I have eraser bits on my mixing palette. Alrighty, so here is my water. I'm going to close my window here on my left because otherwise I'm going to have, hold on, this is way too dark. Otherwise I'm going to have a shadow coming in from the left created by my container. Okay. Awesome. Great. So let's start with our watercolor washes. So let's start with the bear first, shall we? And then we'll tackle the background and the colorful blooms. So for the bear, I think maybe my size 6 round brush is going to be a good size for all of these sections. Make sure that you're choosing a paintbrush that is appropriate for the size of the shape that you're painting in. I think this is okay for the larger sections. And for the bear, we're going to be using both burnt umber and Azo Yellow Deep, or whatever warm yellow it is that you're using. And essentially what I want is I want the belly and these two parts of the feet, the pads here, to be lighter than the rest of the fur. And I also want the snout to be lighter as well, the same color as the belly and the pads and the feet. So what I'm going to prepare on my palette is a puddle of burnt umber. I'm sorry, no, that is burnt sienna. This is burnt umber. A puddle of burnt umber, coffee consistency, and a puddle of Azo Yellow Deep over here. Okay, there we go. I like preparing at the beginning coffee consistency puddles on my palette because once you have, this is a nice consistency where if you need more watered down paint, you can just add in a little bit of water from your container right here along one of the edges of your puddle. And then you can use more of a tea consistency. And then whenever you need to use a thicker consistency, you take your color from this section here, right? As opposed to preparing tea consistency puddles on your palette, it's already going to be very watered down. So you'd need to add in more paint if you want to use it in a thicker consistency. So it just makes sense for me. It's comfortable, right? Once you have these two paint colors, let's go ahead and start painting a section in, okay? So what I like doing is always making sure that I'm creating a nice range, at least a subtle range of values everywhere throughout the painting so that I can achieve a sense of dimension. I'm not really going for a high level of realism here. This is more of an illustration, but making sure that these areas are not painted with a flat color or value is going to make it so at the end you have a result that has more dimension to it. So I'm going to mix these, use different amounts of these colors. If you want to see, let me explain how I'm going to move through this, and then you can do the same. This is the same process I'm going to be using for everything in the bear, by the way. But I go in with a tea consistency yellow, and I start painting in, say, this section here, which I want lighter. This is a very small shape, so notice how often I'm dabbing the tip of my brush on my absorbent towel. But I'm running my paintbrush bristles over this section several times so that it doesn't dry as quickly, okay? And then I can use I can add a little bit of burnt umber into the yellow to get it a little bit darker, and I can pop in a little bit of this color in certain areas to create a slightly darker value in certain areas. So no longer is that shape a flat color, a flat value, okay? I have a lighter section and I have a darker section. And I arrived at a soft looking result because I painted that first lighter layer with my tea consistency yellow. I ran my paintbrush bristles over that section a few times, and then I popped in my second darker color, right? And now I have a nice subtle range of values in that section. I'm going to do the same thing for the other lighter areas, starting with my lighter yellow, which is a tea consistency Azo Yellow Deep. Painting that in, running my paintbrush bristles over everything a few times, then going in with this middle mixture, which has a little bit of burnt umber in it, and popping it in. There you go. Ready. That's it. I'm gonna do the same thing for the belly. Rinse those browns from my paintbrush bristles, and starting with the tea consistency yellow, filling in this shape. running my paintbrush bristles over everything a few times so that it stays wet for a little bit longer. Adding a little bit of burnt umber into the yellow and popping it in, maybe here under the scarf, where the scarf is creating a little shadow in these areas in the belly. And now I have a nice range of kind of yellow and golden values in the belly. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush to paint in the little snout muzzle area. Maybe a size 3 is going to be better. Though the nose is going to be painted with gray. So I could just fill in like paint over the nose with these colors. And because I'm going to be using gray over it, it's the gray is so dark that these lighter colors underneath are not really going to have an impact on the gray. So I could just go ahead and start with the azo yellow. And that is important to kind of think about when painting with this medium because watercolor is transparent. So the color underneath is always going to have an impact on the color that you place on top. But when it's a lighter color and you're going in with a gray over that, it doesn't really affect much. Okay, so now I'm going in with a slightly darker color, a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm dropping it in around the snout. So hopefully you can see how I've achieved at least a couple of different values, like a subtle range in values in all of these areas that I've painted in, as opposed to going in with one flat color, right? And how did I do that? I made sure to think of the colors that would allow me to achieve that subtle range of values in that area. And it's going to vary from object to object. Like you may decide to use analogous colors for this kind of thing. Say I was painting an orange. I do have videos where I explain about different watercolor shading techniques on my channel using analogous colors, complementary colors, and so on. But say I am painting an orange, right? I am likely going to use analogous colors or colors that are next to each other in the color wheel to shade an orange. Why? Because I can use yellow. Like I can start with my base orange, right? Let's just say, well, I don't have a secondary orange here, but let's just say I create my orange by mixing together warm yellow with my warm red, and I create my orange, right? That is going to be my base color. And then all I have to do is, which by the way, red and yellow have, or like red, orange, and yellow are analogous colors in the color wheel, right? So those are analogous colors that I'm going to be able to use to shade my orange, because then all I have to do is consider that base orange as my mid-tone, if you will. And then I create a lighter color mixture by adding in more yellow into it and a darker color mixture by adding more red into it. And I can shade my orange in that way with just 2 colors, right? And creating a series of analogous colors, right? But in other cases, you need to bring in neutrals, because an orange, like, yes, it can get into the red-orange kind of range, if you will, and it's still going to look like an orange. But there are certain objects where if it starts turning red-orange, it's not going to look like that object, like say a banana or even a croissant or something like that, like a bread, right? It doesn't make sense for me to go with analogous colors. I cannot bring in red to darken those. So it makes more sense for me to bring in neutrals like yellow ochre or burnt sienna to create my range of values in a croissant or, like a banana. I would rather bring in browns to darken my yellows and create my range of values and bananas with a brown, or even a complementary color where it starts turning into more of a gray. But I would not use analogous colors in that situation because it's going to change the color too much. And I don't want my banana to start looking like a red orange banana because it's not going to look believable, right? I hope that that makes sense. I have many tutorials where I walk you step by step through different shading techniques. But again, analogous complementary colors, all of that goes back to color theory and understanding the color wheel and color relationships. So again, it's an important art fundamental for you to understand. Okay, so moving on from here, the rest of my bear is going to be darker. So I'm going to use a lot more burnt umber in these areas of the bear, but I still want to develop a nice range of values in the bear, even though I want those sections to look darker. So instead of going in with my plain azo yellow, I'm going to go in with a mix of azo yellow and burnt umber, which kind of looks like a lighter brown, right? Okay, that looks like a lighter brown, almost like a yellow ochre, raw sienna looking color. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little bit more burnt umber into the mix to darken it and create darker areas with more burnt umber. Does that make sense? So you can see what I'm gonna do right now. Going in with a tea consistency light brown. I'm gonna start maybe with this arm here so that I can explain. In that first layer, it's going to look quite similar to this color that I have used in the belly and, these lighter areas that I just painted in. But why? Well, because this is just a lighter color. I haven't added in my darker values. So I'm going over everything 2-3 times, adding more burnt umber into this mixture and dropping it in. And if you're painting an area where shadows are very obviously needed, say under the scarf or there's some overlapping taking place, then add in your darker color in those areas because there would be shadow there. I'm going to add even more burnt umber into this mixture. Maybe even use it in a thicker way this time and push the darker values even more. And there you go. And that's it. Now it looks darker. So I'm going to do the same thing. I rinsed out my paintbrush bristles completely, and I'm starting with a tea consistency light brown. And I'm going to do the same process in all the darker parts of the bear. Okay, starting with the lighter color, running my paintbrush bristles over this a couple of times, and then adding more burnt umber into the mixture, popping it into the shadow areas. And over the same thing. Okay, I'm gonna do the head now. And maybe you might want the inner part of the ear to be lighter, like the golden browns that we created in the belly and the feet. In which case we can totally do that, but just make sure that you leave it unpainted and we'll paint it in just a bit. Or you can paint it all in a dark brown. That's fine too. It all depends. Like however you want to approach it is fine. I'm going to leave it unpainted so that I can paint it separately and explain how I would do that. But this is the first layer with the light brown, golden ochre, yellow ochre, raw sienna looking color. I see that even sheen all throughout the head. I'm going to add more burnt umber into the mixture to darken it. And I'm going to pop it in shadow areas and anywhere that I want to darken. And as long as your paper is still wet, you can drop in more color. But if your paper is starting to dry, I would recommend leaving it alone and using another layer to darken more. Let's see if I can make My lamp is making a lot of, creating a sheen. But once it's dry, you're going to be able to see it better. Okay, great. I'm going to leave that to dry, and I'll work on that section in the ear in just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and work on the legs and the lower part of the body. Same process. If your arms are still wet, you may have bleeds happen if you paint in this section right next to that area which is still wet. So just be careful, or you might just prefer allowing that to dry completely before working on this. That's also an option if you want a little bit more control. Okay, working on this foot over here. During this entire process, we've been working wet on dry. However, or I should explain what that means. Wet on dry is essentially when you are painting on dry paper, right? You haven't done any pre-wetting with clean water, and you're essentially allowing layers to dry before working over them so that you can apply paint on paper that is dry, right? However, I have been achieving soft effects because I have been placing more paint over that initial color while it's still wet. So in a way, I am achieving wet on wet effects, but I'm initially painting on dry paper. Now, the background, I would recommend painting on wet. So I'll explain how I would do pre-wetting to simplify painting the background in just a bit when we get to that. Okay, I'm going to allow these two little feet to dry before painting in this section. I think I should be good to paint in that inner part of the ear. I think this section here is dry enough. So I'm going to remove these colors from my bristles. I'm going to add in more azo yellow on this section of my palette so that I can go in with just plain azo yellow initially. And tea consistency. Maybe you need a smaller brush for this area. So maybe this is a size 3, so maybe a size 0 or 1 would be good. And there it is. I don't want to overly darken that because I want it to look lighter. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and paint in this lower section, which I also want to make look a darker brown. So I'm starting with a light brown, azo yellow plus a little bit of burnt umber, tea consistency. Paint this in. Make sure that you're working swiftly, because since we're working on dry paper, things are going to start drying immediately. The moment you place your paint on your paper, it starts to dry. So one of the essential things about watercolor is that we need to develop water and brush control in the beginning and learn to work faster in order to achieve the effects that we want. So I ran my paintbrush bristles over this entire area a couple of times. And now I'm going to go in with more of this light brown, maybe heavier on the burnt umber this time. And I pop it in there, especially in darker areas that I want to push more. You can add in more burnt umber into the mix to darken it even more. Shadow areas. That's a little bit too dark, so I remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and just softening. You can always soften as long as your paint is still wet. You can soften it with a clean and slightly damp brush, or do lifting as well. You can always use the clean and slightly damp bristles of your brush as a little absorbent sponge if you have overly darkened areas or the paint is expanding too much. Just use a clean and slightly damp brush to lift, or you can go in with your absorbent towel and do lifting in that way. Okay, so I'm going to prepare some of my permanent red light here on my palette. This is a tea consistency, I would say. And I'm just going to go in with a tea consistency. This is my size 3 round brush. And I'm going to paint in the entire red part of the hat with a tea consistency red. I need water in my brush. Sometimes, instead of taking more paint, I just dip my brush in my container so that I can wet it more and I can distribute the paint that is already on my paper and use it to cover up a larger area. Like that's going to soften that color. Why? Because if I take more paint, I'm going to darken it. I don't want to darken it right now. This is just the first layer. I need my light values. So be careful. Always notice what value you're achieving. You always want to start with the lights when working with watercolor. Now I have my first light red layer there developed with a tea consistency red. And now I can go in with a thicker permanent red and I can pop it into shadow areas, maybe behind these fluffy sections. And now you can see how I have darker red areas and lighter red areas. Maybe I even go in and do a little bit of lifting here with a clean and slightly damp brush if the dark red expands too much. And I'm going to leave it alone. And my scarf is going to be green. Okay, so I'm going to do green, yellow, green, yellow, green, like alternating. So I am going to prepare a puddle of sap green right here on my palette, this section over here. I want to keep my red and my green separate because red and green are complementary colors in the color wheel. If they start intermixing, they're going to start muting each other down. And if you mix almost like a 50-50 amount of each, you're going to get a grayish, brownish color, depending on the specific red and green that you're using and their temperature, okay? So all of this is important to have in mind as you are creating this with the same tube as the same quality, as long as it's the same line, Paul. Because again, I don't even know where I have those. Maybe I have them somewhere else. If you're comparing Cotman line from Winsor & Newton pans to Cotman line tubes, yes, it's the same quality. But if you're comparing Winsor & Newton professional grade tubes with Cotman pans, that's not the same quality. Because Winsor & Newton has their professional grade line, which is not Cotman, it's their professional line. I think that's what they refer to it as. And within that, they have both tubes and pans. So if you compare those two, they are the same quality, okay? As long as they are within that professional grade. Their Cotman grade also has tubes and pans. So if you're comparing them together, the Cotman tubes with the pans, then that is the same quality. A lot of people think that most professional watercolor artists, they use tubes. Why? Because as I said, it's a lot more easy to actually set up a palette that is your own, that comes down to your preference, your colors and all this, because you can buy individual paint colors more easily when it comes to tubes, and you can just fill in your palette however you want to, right? So that is why most professional artists use tubes, right? However, when it comes to quality, you could get a professional quality pan and it's going to compete perfectly fine with the tube. Like it's just the format of the paint that you're talking about, but what that paint contains, like the formulation of the paint, the pigments in the paint and all that, it's the same, whether it's pan or tube. It's just different formats. And one thing that I will say is that there are watercolor artists who like using paint squeezed fresh out of the tube. I personally don't like it because I end up wasting a lot of paint. But there are people who do that, or even people who do that in certain parts of the process because of one reason or another. It's they're able to like load up their brush with more pigment, whatever reason it is. It's a different experience because the paint is not dry. It's wet, right? Straight out of the tube, it's wet. So it's easy to work with, right? Personally, it doesn't work for me because what I have seen is that I waste a lot of paint when I just use paint that has been squeezed out of the tube fresh. And what also happens is that I have less control over my consistencies. When I am using paint squeezed out of the tube, oftentimes I load up my brush accidentally with too much paint and I go in too dark and too thick straight away. When in the beginning, I want to go in with a lighter, like a more watered down consistency to build my lighter values. And so, can you develop the skill to do that with tube squeezed out of the tube? Of course you can. Like you can develop the skill to do pretty much anything. However, it all comes down to your preference. I hope that that makes sense. Let's see. I personally enjoy using paint that has dried. Okay, whether it's a pen or whether it's dried on my palette and I just reactivate. You can use a water mister to spritz your paint maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes before you're planning on using it. If you find that your colors are too difficult to activate after they have dried, consider doing that. I will say that depending on the brand, especially student grade paint, oftentimes I see an inconsistency when it comes to how easy you're able to activate certain colors versus other colors. Whereas with professional paint, that doesn't happen as much. Um, so there's that. But yeah, personally, I enjoy using paint that has dried because it makes it easier for me to control my consistencies. It's easier for me to take just a little bit of paint at a time, bring it into my puddle if I want to thicken it, or take just a little bit and then use a more watered down consistency. So I hope that that answered your question. Alrighty, so I'm gonna change or at least hide myself from the stream again, and I'm gonna continue. All right. Great. So let's go ahead and paint the scarf. I don't think anyone like mentioned what color you wanted me to paint the scarf, but I'm just gonna go with green and red. Have right here on my palette. So I'm not gonna go crazy with the scarf because these are small sections, and I'm not going to like fuss too much about making a second darker color to create a darker version of my green and a darker version of my red. However, I'm going to do what I did with the red part of the hat where I add in more green into the mixture and I pop in a darker, more like a thicker version of my green where I want to darken. Thus creating at least a couple of green values using just the same green, because that is one of the beauties of watercolor, is that you can develop somewhat of a range of values with just one single color. However, in other situations, it makes more sense for us to use two colors and mix them. Okay, so I'm gonna skip one, and then I'm gonna do this one, starting with my tea consistency green. Remove that from my bristles, skip one, use a tea consistency green. Thicker green, and popping it in. I'm going to do the same thing for this set of stripes down here. So maybe I skip that one, make it red, and this one is going to be green. And I think I should use a smaller brush. That's way too large. Thicken up the green and popping it in there. Okay, so I was able to develop at least a subtle range of green values in all of the green stripes. I'm gonna allow that to dry. And in the meantime, I'm gonna create a light gray so that I can create some light gray values in the white parts of the hat. Because yes, these parts are meant to look white, like a white material, but I cannot leave them just white like that because it's going to look too flat and it's going to lead to a flat result. When I've been working so hard on developing a nice range of values everywhere, so I want to develop a range of values in that part of the hat as well. So we're just going to keep it simple and use our gray, whatever gray it is that you're using, whether it's Payne's gray like me or a neutral tint, even a neutral black. You could add a little bit of blue into that if you want to make it look less like, just give it a more of a vibrant, interesting look, or just use it like that. It's up to you. Or you could even create your gray by mixing together different colors. Like, for example, as I said, if you mix complementary colors together, opposites in the color wheel, you're going to get a grayish, brownish looking color depending on the colors that you're mixing together. But one of my favorite ways to make gray is combining burnt sienna, which is a reddish brown, with ultramarine blue. Hold on. Where's my ultramarine blue here? This one is my ultramarine blue. Okay. And by mixing together the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, you're going to get a beautiful gray by mixing together approximately 50% of those two colors together. Same thing with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. Any brown, sepia, Van Dyke brown, any brown like that mixed together with ultramarine blue is going to give you a beautiful, vibrant gray. So that's an option as well. There are many, many ways that you can make grays. But let's just keep it really simple today and water down a ready-made gray if you have one. Jane's gray from Daniel Smith is another one that you can use. And what I'm going to do is just paint in a little bit of gray here and there just to create a sense of dimension, like a shadow effect, and also enhance the textures in this part of the hat. All I am doing is touching the tip of my brush to, certain parts of my paper, maybe wiggling it or doing a bit of a scribbling motion so that I can again help describe that texture in that part of the picture. But make sure that you're keeping plenty of that paper unpainted because that paper is going to make it look white. If you cover it up with gray, then it's going to look like a light gray material, not a white material. What we're painting right now are shadow shapes created by the little clusters of this like furry texture, right? So that's it. That's all I'm going to do for that. And now I'm going to go in and paint the red stripes in the scarf. Right now my red has dried on my palette, so I'm reactivating it with my size 3 brush and a little bit of water. And I'm going to use this red in the same way that I did with the hat, where I go in first with a very watered down consistency, and then I thicken up the red and I pop in a little bit of red here and there in shadow areas. Use whatever paintbrush size that you're comfortable with. I understand that these are very small shapes and you might want an even smaller brush. I'm going to paint 2 at a time. So see, that's a very light red. I'm going to add a little bit more red into this puddle. This red is very intense, so I might end up darkening things too much, but we'll see. If I do, I'll stop and I'll do a little bit of lifting. I think that's good. I'm gonna do these other stripes here at the bottom. Paint that in with a light red. Run your paintbrush bristles over these shapes 2-3 times to avoid having them dry super quickly. And pop in a little bit more red. These sections over here are still wet, so if I wanted to drop in some more red, I can do that. I'm going to paint this red section very carefully because this part right here is still wet. And they're just going to start merging together if I'm not careful. I just dipped my brush in my container of water instead of grabbing more paint again, because if I did, I would darken everything too much. Okay, awesome. So once this is done, we can go in and paint the dark grays and black looking color in the nose and the eyes. We talked about saving the highlights in the eyeballs. That's important because highlights in eyes are what makes an animal or a person really come to life. If we don't add highlights or even not develop at least a couple of values in the eyeballs, the thing can look dead, is what I have noticed. And so I understand that the highlight shapes are very small. So if you want to paint in the entire eyeball with your gray, allow that to dry and then add in the highlight with just a very small brush and white gouache or a white paint pen or something like that. That is another option. That is perfectly fine to do. But if you want to try to work around the highlights and leave them unpainted so that the white highlights can just be the paper shining through, you can try to do that as well. It's up to you. If you're going to be working around the highlights, it is especially important that you're working with a fine brush that comes to a nice fine tip, because these are very small shapes. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do it, but I'll try. So I'm going to go in initially with what I would say is like coffee consistency. Even though these are made, I want these to look very, very dark, like a dark gray or black. I would rather work in layers and develop like a gray mid-tone value before going in with another layer. It gives me a little bit more control. So you can see how this doesn't look black. It looks like a gray. And as watercolor dries, it will dry lighter. So once it dries, if I want to go in, I can even save a little highlight in the nose if I want and just leave that little section of yellow unpainted. But yeah, so I go in with a color that looks like a gray at first, and then I can develop some even darker sections within that eyeball. And this way I can have one value as the highlights. Second value is the gray that I have just painted. And then I have a third value in the eyeball, which is going to be the darkest section. So I have 3 values. But even if you're just developing the very dark gray and the highlight, that is fine too, okay? Great. So let's get started with the background, shall we? Because that's going to be an interesting part to paint, and we're going to be able to practice a couple of different techniques here. Um, I would love to practice pre-wetting everything with you because pre-wetting is an excellent way to make the process easier for you, especially when it comes to painting larger washes. Because again, if I were to paint this entire background on one go on dry paper, probably by the time I'm at the halfway point, this part on the top is going to be dry. And so it helps me paint like struggle less because by pre-wetting, I am expanding that time that I have available to work before my paint starts to dry because I have already fed my paper water. It's no longer as thirsty if I have done pre-wetting, right? And at the same time, it's going to help me arrive at these soft effects that I want in my background as opposed to like a heavily textured area that can really be distracting and can take away from the focal point. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to do the pre-wetting. And then in this background area, we're also going to be doing some blooms in the light. So we need to have those colors ready on our palette so that we can pop in those blooms while the background gray color is still wet. Okay. And then this shadow area, I think I'm going to paint after everything dries so that the shadow can be a sharper shape. Okay. If I wanted my cast shadow shape to be blurred, then I could just paint it in over the wet paper at once, like as in painting the background, and I'll be all done. So it all depends on whether you want your cast shadow shape to be sharp or blurred. Okay, if you want it sharp, make sure you paint it on dry paper. If you want it blurred, you can go ahead and paint it in over the gray background color while it's still wet. Okay, so let me just go ahead and paint in the final like darkest value in the eyes because at this point the eyeballs are dry. So I'm just going to add in a little bit more Payne's Gray on my palette, going in very, very thick and dark this time. And I'm just going to paint in like a crescent moon shape along the lower left or left half of the eyeball. Maybe a tiny bit over here as well. I'm going to soften very, very carefully, just soften the edge just a little. Ready. If you want to do the same thing in the nose and add in some final darkest values in the nose, you can do that too with a thicker gray this time. And that is it. Okay. So let's do this. All right. Main color of the background and the cast shadow is going to be Payne's Gray. So I'm going back to my size 14 round brush. Okay, the first thing that we need to do is prepare the colors that we're going to be using for this part of the process, all right? So the main color or the base color for this is going to be Payne's Gray. So that's a nice large puddle of Payne's Gray, okay? But we also need, as I said, the colors that we're going to be popping in for the lights, which are going to be yellow, red, and green. And you can choose what if you want to bring in more colors or you just want to keep it at yellow and red or red and green. It's totally your choice, okay? But I need to make sure that I have these puddles ready for me on my palette. So here is the sap green. I'm again trying to create a tea consistency on my palette for all of these colors. I'm going to remove this green from my paintbrush bristles and reactivate this permanent red light. And I also need yellow. So I'm going to just like rinse out or clean out this part of my palette here because I have a lot of brown and I want a bright yellow. So if brown is in there, the yellow is not going to look very bright. I want a bright yellow for the lights. And to do that, I want to keep things clean, keep my colors separate. So I rinsed out my brush, and there you go. There's a clean Azo Yellow Deep puddle on my palette. Okay, so I have my colors ready. Payne's Gray, nice big puddle because I'm going to be using quite a bit. In a watered down consistency though. My entire background, the bulk of it is going to be pretty light. Sap Green, Permanent Red Light, and Azo Yellow Deep. Okay. Now I am going to replace this water because take a look, it's very murky. And when I do pre-wetting, I need it to be clean. So I'm going to go ahead and change this and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm ready. Clean water in my container. Colors are ready on my palette. And what I do want to make sure to have on hand is a second brush. Aside from my size 14, which is what I'm going to be using to pre-wet and paint the background, I have this size, it's a size 4 brush on hand. And this is the brush that I'm going to be using to pop in my light colors for my lights, okay? Now, I explained about the bloom technique last Saturday, I believe it was, when we were painting the snow globe. In order for the bloom technique to happen, you need to drop in your second color over your first color while it's still wet. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Okay, so let me just show you an example right here of what we're going to be doing. Okay, the first thing that we're going to be doing is pre-wetting the entire background area. Okay, around the bear, of course. You're going to be pre-wetting with your larger brush until you arrive at an even sheen all throughout the background. Okay, you'll see that even sheen. If certain parts of your paper are starting to dry too fast, it means you haven't pre-wetted enough, okay? So take your time with the pre-wetting process and make sure that you see that even sheen, no puddles, all throughout the background, okay? See that? And then what you're going to do is you're going to start dropping in your gray. This is Payne's Gray. And you can see how, because I'm painting in this Payne's Gray on paper that is wet, the water that is on my paper is being added to the water in my mixture. So the gray looks pretty light. And this is why when I am painting my color on paper that is wet, I can go in with more of a coffee consistency because, you know, I know that it's going to look lighter than, say, when I am using this on dry paper. If I'm using this on dry paper, it's going to look darker. Whereas if you drop it into paper that is wet, especially if you manually like soften it, it's going to look very soft. Okay. So once your background gray color is achieved, once you've painted that in, it's still wet. Okay. See that? It is still wet because I took my time with the pre-wetting process. If you did it quickly, it's going to dry quickly. But you need to make sure that you pre-wet your paper effectively. But once I have painted in my background gray, I quickly change to my size 4 round brush. And what I'm going to do is pop in my green, my yellow, and my red in my lights, right over the little lights, okay? This is just an example. And those are blooms. Let me pop in a red. And pop in a yellow. what you see happening right here is referred to as a bloom. These blooms would not happen if I try to place this paint on paper that has dried, okay? So you have to make sure to work swiftly, paint in that background color, and then while it's still wet, pop in your blooms of whatever color you'd like over your little lights so that they look like glowing lights. Okay, I hope that that makes sense. Let's do this. Paint is ready, brushes are ready, and I'm just gonna go ahead and pre-wet the entire background area with my size 14. Taking a little bit of water from my container at a time. And making my way around the bear. I'm bringing down my gray into this area at the bottom, and I'm gonna be adding in my handwritten letter, handwritten message over this gray. Especially because it's gonna be pretty light. I'm trying not to wet the bear, but if you accidentally go into the bear a little bit, it's okay. You can do a little bit of lifting with your absorbent towel. I'm going over everything again, top to bottom. Don't worry about the teeny tiny negative spaces. Say if you ended up with a little negative space there in between the hat and the bear's cheek, you can paint that later, wet on dry with a smaller brush. Okay, don't worry about those smaller little negative spaces. Because if you worry about that right now, you're gonna be making this process, like you're gonna take so long focusing on those little spots. And you know, if you stress too much about getting into every single nook and cranny of the bear, like right now, things will start to dry on you too fast. So you can fix that later after you've developed your gray valleys in the background. Don't worry about that too much. Let's see. Let's see if I can show you this, but all of my background is wet and I see an even sheen all throughout, except for that little teeny tiny negative space in between the red part of the hat and the cheek. I'll paint that in later, okay? I have a little bit of a puddle here. I'm just gonna absorb that excess water. Just pulling along the edge of my masking tape. And I'm gonna get started with my gray. Oof, hold on. My pencil is, there it is, okay. So I'm gonna start with my gray. Coffee consistency gray. And I'm just gonna start painting it in. Painting in a light gray all throughout my background. I'm really trying to not to worry about the edges too much, because first I want to focus on the bulk of the background and getting a nice effect just with the gray, and then I can switch to a smaller brush and push that wet paint into those little areas if I need to. Going in with a bit of a thicker consistency Payne's gray. And as I said, if you want to, you can paint in the cast shadow right now over your wet paper if you want to arrive at a bit of a softer look around those edges. If not, you can allow your paper to dry and paint it in later. I like a nice variety of values in my background instead of a flat gray, so that's what I'm doing here. If you'd like more of a flat gray, then just leave it as a flat gray. I'm going to change to my size 4 round brush. Clean up my edges very quickly by pushing that wet paint into those little slivers of white paper that I left unpainted. Paint in this little negative shape really quick. Wet on dry. Remove that gray from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and I'm gonna go in to pop in my blooms. So I'm gonna start with a yellow, load up my size 4 round, and I'm just gonna touch the tip of my brush to that paper. Just up and down, and you create that bloom. And by going like this multiple times, you're gonna make that bloom larger, okay? If you just go in and touch the tip once, it's gonna stay relatively small. If you go in multiple times, you're gonna make it larger and larger, okay? I think that's enough yellow. Sorry, my husband just sneezed, if you heard that. I'm gonna pop in some green blooms now. Maybe one over here, and then the others are going to be red. I should also say that if your paper is very, very wet, you're going to have more expansion. That bloom is going to expand more, okay? If your paper is not wet, maybe it's just damp, you are going to have soft edges around that bloom, or you will be able to achieve a bloom with soft edges, but it's not going to expand as much because the wetter the paper is, the more your paint is going to expand, okay? So if you find your paint is expanding too much, it's moving too fast, you might want to allow that paint, to settle on your paper for a little bit longer before painting in your blooms. Okay, going in with the red. We'll paint that little section on top after the paper has dried, okay? I don't want to make these lights super, super dark and contrasting with the red especially. These can end up being very, very dark. This red is very intense. So I need to be careful with these colors because I don't want them to take away from the bear. Okay, great. So that is it. I'm going to allow this to dry. And in just a moment, we can go ahead and paint in the shadow and the little connective parts of the lights, wet on dry, and add in our handwritten lettering. In the meantime, if you would like to add a little bit more contrast or detail or texture into the bear itself, you totally can. Let's just say, like many times with line and wash, I do just like going in with one single layer. But if you want to add in a little bit more depth, a little bit more detail, you can certainly work in 2 layers or even 3 layers. Okay, just make sure that you're not doing too much. So, as an example, say I wanted to add a little bit of depth to the bear. In that case, I go back to the 2 colors that I was using in the fur, which were the burnt umber and the azo yellow deep. I create that kind of mid-tone that I was using initially for the dark part of the bear. And all I have to do with a small brush, this is a size 3 round, is I paint in some shadow shapes, maybe under the hat, where it would make sense. You can even use little teeny tiny brush strokes if you want to describe fur texture a little bit more via watercolor, right? And just by developing shadow shapes, you're going to all of a sudden end up with more of a 3D-ness, more depth in your artwork. Now, if when you're painting your shadow shapes, you cannot see them, just go a little bit darker. Add in a little bit more of your brown into your mixture and that will darken the mix, and you can paint in your shadow shapes with a darker brown. It all depends on how dark your bear looks at this point. We can do this work while the background dries. Because we did pre-wetting in the background, it is going to take a little bit longer to dry. So that is to be expected. Softening some edges with a clean and slightly damp brush. So you can see how I'm developing contrast. Whoops, I got a bleed there. Saw that? See that? That's a bleed. Why? Because the background is still wet. That's cool. I'm gonna leave it. Okay, so that's really all you have to do if you want to darken areas. Just go in with the same colors that you were using in those areas before. And if you don't see the lighter color of the two, just add in more brown to darken it slightly. And this will expand the range of values in the bear. It will add more depth. Whether you're joining from YouTube, or maybe you've never seen any of my tutorials before, and you're just like getting to know what I share. You've never seen any of my tutorials before, and this is our first time meeting. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you found me. I hope that you're enjoying this and are finding it valuable. But whether you are joining from YouTube or you're a Patreon member, make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I cannot explain how much it means to me and how much it helps me know that I'm kind of sharing what you need, so that I can continue. All right. And it's free. Otherwise, it's likely that you're not going to see me again if you're not a Patreon member. Okay. Great. I don't want to do too much in the bear. I don't want to overdo it, but I did add in some darker areas, as you can see. Really helps the bear pop a little bit more and provides more contrast to this focal point subject, so that I can really understand that the bear is closer to us than, say, the lights. I actually really like how those bleeds look. A bleed is simply when you like a section or an element of your painting has not dried and you paint in right next to it. That new fresh paint is going to expand into that paint that has not yet dried, or that area that has not yet dried. That happened right here. And sometimes you can use bleeds intentionally to create beautiful effects where parts of the painting integrate, and this creates a very cohesive look. Now, if I wanted to develop a little bit more detail in, say, the hat, I would add in a little bit of gray into the red to darken it. That's too much. I'm just looking for a bit of a darker red than what I already have. I think that'll work. And I can just go in and create the shadow shapes in the red hat. Create more depth in the hat as well. I'm not looking to cover up the previous layer. I'm just looking to darken certain sections. think that's enough. Same thing with the scarf. If you wanted to add in more depth, you can go in to paint shadow shapes. Just in those areas where you need the shadows to expand that range of values and add depth and contrast. I think that's all I'm gonna do, because if I continue adding and adding, this is going to lose its freshness. Bit of a darker value of gray right here in the white sections of the hat, just so that I can see them better, and that's it. That's all I'm gonna do. Now all of this has to dry completely before I paint in the shadow and the little light, I don't know what they are called, but those little things that connect the little light bulb to the cable, string, whatever you want to call it. Awesome, Valerie. I'm glad you're following me on YouTube. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. Yeah. So at the moment, this bottom part, for example, is pretty dry. I wouldn't go in and do my handwritten lettering right now because it's still damp and I can run the risk of damaging my paper if I do that. But this section over here is wetter over here in this upper section of the background than, say, this one over here. So I need to allow that to dry more, okay? I think the inner part of the ear gets lost a little bit with the outer part of the ear, so I'm just going to create a bit of a shadow shape with my burnt umber here. It really helps to see your drawings and paintings through a screen, whether it's through video, like I, see my work so often because I'm filming videos and stuff, but also even through your camera's viewfinder, your cell phone or whatever camera you use. You're able to see little mistakes or things that you can't really see if you are not seeing through your camera viewfinder. There it is. Now I can see it better. Okay, I'm gonna paint in the cast shadow. The edges may end up being a little bit fuzzy because, as I said, the section here is still a little bit damp, but that's okay. So what I'm gonna do is thicken up my Payne's Gray mix, and using whichever paintbrush size you feel is helpful for you for this size of shape. This is my size 6, just as an FYI. You can go in and paint the shadow shape. There it is, all done. You can see how the edges are a little bit fuzzy, and that's because the paper is still a little bit wet. The same thing would happen if I go in and paint these little connective things, whatever they are called. Right now, the paper is still a little bit damp. So I'm gonna end up with these little like fuzzy edges, though it might not be so bad because these are background elements and I want to push them back. So it all depends on your situation, but what's ultimately most important is that you, before moving on to the next part of the process, you kind of think about the effects that are going to happen if you go in right now, right? Like take a pause, take a moment and ask yourself, if I go in right now, what's going to happen? If I go in on damp paper, what's going to happen? If I go in on dry paper, what's going to happen? Um, if I were painting these little sections on dry paper, I would 100% make sure to go in with a tea consistency gray, because if I painted in these little light sections with a very, very dark gray, what's going to happen is that they are going to compete with the bear. I would rather create more contrast, more saturation, more detail in the bear than these sections, because I want to bring it forward, right? We have to think about these things. These things all come down to composition and making sure that you're using watercolor in a way that is going to help you achieve depth in this case, or whatever effect you're after. Um, but yeah, I don't want these to compete with the bear or to push them forward too much. So I think that ended up looking nice. My paper was damp. There are many degrees of wetness or dampness that we can that are workable when we're working with this medium, depending on what we're after. However, once your paper starts to dry, I would really advise to not do anything, because if certain parts of your paper have already started to dry and you go in and try to layer watercolor over that section, it's going to lead to splotchiness, to back runs, and all that kind of stuff. A lot of texture and stuff, which you probably don't want. Instead, like when working with watercolor, it's much better to, if things didn't end up the way you wanted them to, maybe do a little bit of quick lifting with either your brush or your absorbent towel, then allow that to dry completely and fix it with another layer or some gentle scrubbing after the paint has dried, instead of freaking out and going in and trying to fix everything like right away, because oftentimes that's just going to make it worse is what I have found. And you're going to end up with overworked results. So yeah, with watercolor, ultimately, the less layering, the less manual blending, like all of that stuff oftentimes leads to better, fresher results. And this is very difficult, because this medium is so different from other mediums, say like acrylic or oils, where those are opaque painting mediums, and you like it is expected to go in and do lots of layering and lots of blending and covering up your substrate, which in those cases is more like canvas or canvas board or wood or tougher material when compared to paper. Like watercolor is a very, very different medium, because we're painting on paper, which is way more fragile. Um, and because we're using a transparent or translucent medium, we're bringing in the paper as part of the piece. We don't need white. We work from lights to darks as opposed to darks to lights, which is what usually happens when painting with opaque painting mediums. The less we do, the more confident we go in. And this is why it's so important to go in with a strategy. You can go in with more confidence, knowing the techniques that you're going to be bringing in, knowing the colors that you're going to be bringing in, because you're not going to be able to fix those mistakes with watercolor. With acrylics and oils, you can scrape off that paint or paint over it and you're done. But with watercolor, you really, you maybe if it's a small mistake, you can make it less noticeable, but you're not going to fix larger mistakes. You're never going to be able to go back to the whiteness and the brightness the paper once had, even if you use non-staining colors. It's important to go in with some sort of strategy and like anticipate what's going to happen before painting in a new area, right? Okay, everyone. So that is it in terms of the painting process. Now I'm just gonna quickly add in my handwritten lettering. My paper is not, I would not say it is fully dry. I'm just gonna do it very, very carefully. I would recommend allowing this to dry completely before you do yours. Maybe yours is already dry. But I'm gonna go back to my drawing pen. And I have shared in past classes that I am not good at handwritten lettering. I'm not a specialist. I have never practiced it before, really. And what I just like doing is making sure that I'm accounting for the number of letters in this case in each of these lines so that I can just keep my words sort of centered within my space. So if I'm going to do happy holidays, Merry Christmas, whatever you want to do, just count the letters. Here I have 5 and here I have 8. So for happy, which is going to be here at the top line, I need to make sure that this P is right in the center. And then I build the H and the A and the P and the Y to the left and to the right of that. And in this one, I need to make sure that the I and the D are in the center. Okay, we have an odd number here and an even number here. So in this case, I need the I and the D to be centered, and I'll build the LOH to the left and the AYS to the right. Okay, I'm going to keep it really simple and just do capital letters. And then what I do with my drawing pen is I just build like a box or a shape around that letter. Okay, and then I can erase my pencil. Okay. So I hope you can see this. I used like my pencil lines. I just wrote a simple, normal capital H and A, and I just built a box around those with my drawing pen. And then I just erase the pencil. So I'm left with bubble letters. And then sometimes I fill them in. Other times I don't. It depends. So that's how I end up with my bubble letters, okay? And that's just what I'm going to do. And while I do this, I'm going to try to concentrate because this is a little bit more challenging for me because, again, I'm not good at this. But while I finish up, if you have any last questions for me, please type them into the chat, and I'd be happy to help you guys out because I am going to leave in just a few minutes. I hope that you enjoyed this session, this last line and wash session for this special holiday series that I shared here on YouTube. I really hope that you were able to check out the other ones as well. If you haven't, they are on my channel. In the live tab, you're going to find the recordings to the last 3 classes. And if you're a Patreon member, thank you so much for being on Patreon. My Patreon is really my main priority when it comes to the educational resources that I share. And I'm just so amazed by just the amazing people that are in there, like connecting with you guys in the community chats on Patreon. And getting to know you more has been truly just a joy, and I'm so honored that I'm able to be even just a small part of your art journey. So thank you so much for being this part of that innermost art community of mine. And I am really looking forward to 2026. I have so many plans. I do have some organizing and a lot of kind of admin organizing and planning work to do so that next year can go super smoothly and I can hit the ground running. And the second half of December is going to be a lot of that work. And on Patreon, I will be sharing along the way. I am going to be doing many more of these live streams. I'm thinking of doing one every month. Obviously not holiday themed, but more like what I do on a normal basis throughout the year, like drawing houses, drawing still life, sometimes even drawing animals, watercolor painting, line and wash, even watercolor pencil. Like all of that I love. And as you know, I am very much multimedia artist. I really enjoy challenging myself with different mediums and different subjects. So I will never ever be just one single medium or one single type of painting because that would definitely take the joy out of art for me. It's the reason why I've been able to stay away or avoid burnout and art block because I allow myself to explore different mediums within a range, right? And different subject matter. It keeps things just interesting and fun for me. So if you're like myself, then welcome. I'm so glad you found me, and I would just love it if you would stick around, whether it's on YouTube or on Patreon or both. Of course, everything that I share on YouTube goes on Patreon first. So there's that. There are many things that I share on Patreon that I don't share on YouTube. Okay, so I'm almost done with my bubble letters with my pencil here, and I'm really trying not to damage my paper because it's not 100% dry. As the paper dries, it regains its strength. So do have that in mind. Sometimes you need to allow that paper to regain its strength. Okay, I'm missing an O. So hopefully it makes sense why starting with the letter in the middle of the word or the two letters in the middle of the word, if it's an even number of letters, helps you center things in space at least a little bit better. But yeah, really excited about next year. Really looking forward to doing some new things. And I'll be definitely keeping you posted. Okay. So apparently I'm going to be cut off in just around like 4 minutes. My live streaming software is telling me that I went too long and it's going to cut me off. So this is essentially what I do, and I'm just going to go ahead and trace over my pencil work that I just did here in pen and ink. I hope that it made sense. This was I'm so happy it was useful, Barb and Valerie. Have a wonderful Sunday and an amazing rest of your holiday season. I hope you guys have wonderful celebrations with your loved ones, or even if you're just spending some time on your own, that's fine too. I love being alone. A lot of, I'm really an introvert. I love being alone. Anyway, whatever you decide to do to end this year, I wish you peace. Hope you have lovely, just reflecting time during this time of the year. To close the year in a peaceful and inspiring way and set yourself up for success for 2026. Have a wonderful rest of your year. I look forward to 2026 and everything that is to come. Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm looking forward to seeing you on Patreon as well. And Susie, stay tuned for next year's live classes because I'm excited to share more information on that very soon over on Patreon. I wish you a very Merry Christmas as well. Thank you so much, Susie. I appreciate you. And thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining. Hold on. Thanks so much for joining me on this series. Have a great rest of your 2025. Wish you a wonderful rest of your holiday season wonderful celebrations with your loved ones, and all the best for you and your loved ones for 2026. Looking forward to sharing a lot more next year and see you guys very soon. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Melinda. Merry Christmas, everyone. Bye.